All right, welcome everybody to the October 9th regular council meeting for the city of Courtenay. Thanks for joining us today. I'd like to begin by respectfully acknowledging the land in which we're gathered as the unceded territory of the Comox First Nation, the traditional keepers of this land. And I'm going to pass it over to Councillor Jolicoeur.
Thanks, Mayor. I want to draw people's attention to tomorrow being October 10th, 2024, being World Mental Health Day. And the World Mental Health Day serves as a reminder that mental health is just as vital as physical health and deserves our attention, compassion, and support. It is a day to recognize the struggles and triumphs of those living with mental health challenges, to acknowledge the importance of self-care, and to advocate for better access to mental health services for everyone. This day is about breaking down stigma, fostering understanding, and empowering individuals to seek help without shame. By coming together, we can build a more compassionate world where everyone feels safe, supported, and supported to discuss mental health openly, paving the way for a healthier, happier future for all. So on tomorrow's World Mental Health Day, maybe you can get out into the world and connect with those in your life to talk about how you can support each other as it relates to your mental health. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Councillor Jolicoeur. And yeah, it's definitely a reminder to reach out to those that maybe you haven't heard from for a period of time, and just make sure everybody's doing well. With that, we'll move into regular council minutes. If somebody would like to move those. Oh, sorry, I skipped past late items because no one had talked to me, but I'm assuming there's no late items. Want me to do it again?
We're tight friends, man.
Thank you, sir.
It's all good.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No. I need to get a mirror or something. Yeah, fantastic. Wow. I feel more relaxed now, so that's good. So our minutes have been moved and seconded, I believe. Were there any error or omissions? And seeing none, we'll accept those unanimously. And we'll move into staff reports for flood management plan, and I'll pass it over to Mr. Garvin.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We'll start. Ms. Tezioli is going to give a short introduction. We have our great consulting group here to give us a presentation on this important work.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. Today we are pleased to present the Flood Management Plan for adoption and implementation. This plan represents years of analysis, consultation, and collaboration as we worked to identify the preferred approaches to reduce flood risk in the city of Courtenay. I'll pass it over to Tamsin Lyle, Principal Engineer from Ebwater Consulting, to share more about the Flood Management Plan.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for hosting me here on Comox territory. So my name, as Janita said, is Tamsin Lyle. I am the principal and founding engineer with a firm called Ebwater Consulting. We're based in Vancouver on the unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh people. And I am here today at the culmination of a couple of years of work. I have interacted with some of you. Does everyone remember Council Lunch and Learn? Excellent. It's about 18 months ago. I just looked at it. It's quite a long time ago, so I'm glad you remember. But this is the culmination of all that work, so I'm excited to present where we've landed in terms of our understanding and learning about the community and the flood risks, as well as providing you with some clear recommendations and pathways to move forward. This is a much prettier picture. I should have been hanging out on this one. Starting at the beginning, to provide a bit of context, I believe most of you have lived in the region for a long time and recognize that floods is something that you face on a fairly frequent basis. And I think many of you were here in 2014, which was the last very significant event. So you'll remember in your hearts how that felt when your community was flooded. But I would like to note that this is an issue that's been in the area since time immemorial. The fact that the city is here on an alluvial floodplain is because it exists because of the floodplain itself. So the rivers have deposited soils and alluvium on the ground, which created the area that you have now settled. And so floods are both the reason you're here, and water is the reason you're here, but also obviously very impactful over time. Another really important thing that you all know, because you live here, is that water comes from all sides in this community. You have multiple rivers, that the confluence of the Solom and the Puntledge into the Courtney, and then the Courtney into the Salish Sea and the estuary. So you have a mix of different types of flood sources and flood events. You've got the rain events that melt the snow that land on the mountains and come down and flood the community, as well as coastal events that can flood the coastal areas on their own, and also the combination of these two things, which has happened and will happen again. But, you know, you've experienced this. This is something that your community knows. So you've also been working on this forever, for many, many years anyhow, and have, with your community partners, including the CVRD, this building we sit in today, have developed a number of specific actions and plans and studies, and over the years that have all been leveraged in support of this work. Very importantly, we leveraged the work of the CVRD's Coastal Flood Mapping Project. They developed regional mapping showing where the flood hazards are. They also did the Coastal Flood Adaptation Strategy, which looked at some of the community values that we wanted to protect in the region. All of that has been leveraged and combined with some of your own regulations and materials, including the official community plan, to get us to where we are today, in setting out a vision for where the community can go with flood management into the future. Quick overview of what we did, and also the flow of the presentation today. We spent a bit of time working with those materials and leveraging the things that were already done, as well as doing a lot of analysis, a lot of math, working with the community to really understand the complexity of the flood risk problem in the region. We sought input from the community. We had a number of events, public events, affected party events, and then we looked at a lot of different options that were available to the community to reduce the risk and increase the resilience, to support the development of a flood management plan. And what we're here to do today is really to inspire you to act on this plan to reduce the risk going forward. And I did want to note on this slide that that's obviously a lot of things. And so it wasn't just me doing this work. We had a very large team as part of this project. It was a multidisciplinary team that reflects the multidisciplinary challenge of this particular problem. We worked with civil engineers, Water Street, who did a lot of work understanding designs and costing for concept levels for infrastructure, dikes and those kind of things. We worked with a planner from Adapt Collaborative to look at the bylaws, to review the policy, to provide recommendations on how the bylaw could be updated in future. Again, in support of the larger process. And we worked with engagement specialists who supported with all of our engagement with yourselves, as well as with affected parties and also with the public. So there was a large team behind me, including the staff at the City of Courtney, who developed this, and it really reflects both the sort of holistic approach we took to this work, as well as the complexity of the problem itself. So I'm sure everyone remembers the Lunch and Learn, precisely all of those details, but just in case you don't, I have a couple of slides to remind people of what we're talking about today. So as I already mentioned, we've got two distinct but very interlinked flood hazards in this area, from the rivers themselves, when you have large water volumes coming down, either because of rainfall or rain on top of snow or snow melting. It can come down and overflow onto the floodplains. This also has a secondary action of creating erosion. So I know this council in particular is well versed in flood erosion. And then of course you have all of the coastal issues as the high tides combined with storm surges. I'm sure you're all watching the news today, looking at what's happening in Florida. We don't have that level of storm surge here, but we do still have storm surges. So keep that in mind. We've also got wave action. All of those things that you're seeing, in the extreme case in Florida are things that will happen here at a much smaller level. And all of these things are, of course, varied in time and space. So there's different levels of hazard in different parts of the community. And these will change with time, with climate change. So we expect different volumes of water to be coming down the rivers. And we also, as you know, have sea level rise, which is slowly stressing our marine environments and increasing our coastal flood hazard. So some of you will have seen these maps because you've all everyone read the whole tome, right? All 500 pages. Maybe you just skimmed the maps. These maps have actually been sitting, the maps are the best. The maps have been available publicly on your website for I think more than a year at this point. And they show the extent of flooding that is anticipated in the community. So you do in the present day have, a flood hazard risk. It is, fairly extensive in terms of the sort of area next to the river, but large flat areas, obviously, they flood. But in terms of the overall context of the city, perhaps not taking over your whole city as it is in some other places. But there is a very significant present day flood hazard. You know this, especially if you were here in 2014 and remember the event. As we move to the future with climate change, we have more water coming down the rivers in more extreme events. And we also have sea level rise that's putting pressure on the system where they join there. And so the big difference between these two, and maybe I can flip back and forward, is not so much the extent of the floodplain. It hasn't dramatically increased in size, but the depth of the water, which is shown with those colors where yellow is not very much, and the blues get deeper and deeper into the meters of water. That increases fairly significantly into the sort of 2050s, mid-century, and will get even worse into the far future, 100 years hence. And this is particularly true for the coastal areas where the sea level rise plays more and more of a dominant role in terms of the level of water to be expected and the frequency of flooding that will be here. So deeper water along the way. The other thing I wanted to note here is that, and sort of remembering back to the little cartoons of the flood hazard, and the note there, which things vary in time and space. There are areas of the city that are more affected by flood hazard, they're more frequently affected, and the danger is higher. And that is because the water is deeper and the water is faster. So it doesn't take, if the water is moving, it can pick a car up. But if it's still and on the fringes, then you're just wandering around in your galoshes. So that's a very important part of the flood hazard and is a very important part of the approach that we took to this flood management plan, was recognizing that nuance across the city. Now, lunch and learn, people. Do you remember the triangle? Some of you remember the triangle. This is also a really important piece of the work and the approach that we took. We use this idea of risk as being the basis of the plan and less so the hazard. And so if you remember the triangle, it has three sides. The area inside the triangle is the risk. And that's really what we're trying to avoid. It's not so much the fact that water is here, but that the water is interacting negatively with the things that we care about. So the area inside of the triangle is the risk. It's got three sides: hazard, bad thing, flood on one side. Other side is exposure. So that is the 2D space, all of the things that you care about that are interacting with the blue on those maps that we just saw, all of the exposed elements. And the third part of the triangle that creates the risk is the vulnerability or susceptibility to being damaged in a flood. So if you imagine your family, small children will get washed away by that water. The larger people in your family may not. So that's sort of one example of how vulnerability plays a role. It's also really important if we think about city infrastructure. You think about a park bench, not very vulnerable to flooding, a substation or a lift station with lots of mechanical and electrical, very vulnerable to flooding. It will be less recoverable, it'll cost more, it'll take longer to recover. So all of these three elements are very important in terms of determining risk, and which is the basis of our work. And the goal should be pretty obvious, is to not increase that risk and ideally to reduce the risk. Another important note here, the reason we use risk as the basis of the plan is that we were following international best practice and guidance in the form of what's called the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which is also mirrored in federal legislation and guidance. And I'm happy to say is also mirrored in, and more importantly, in the provincial legislation that guides a lot of your work. So EDMA, the new Emergency and Disaster Management Act, came into force in September 2023. It is a risk-based approach. And so as the regulations associated with that new piece of legislation come out, you will see a requirement that communities take a risk-based approach to their hazards. And then finally, I'd like to note that this also aligns really well with the BC flood strategy, which was released in March 2024. So this is an overarching document from the province that sets out how the province, as well as communities under the Local Government Act, should consider and look at flood and how to manage flood. Also risk-based. So I'm pleased to say that we were ahead of the curve on this one. We saw where this was going, and I heard you all talking about hockey. I know nothing about hockey, but I will say in this case, we were going to where the puck was going and not where the puck is. I think I kind of got that right. We did our best in this flood plan. To do that. I got to work on my hockey metaphors. All right, with risk as the basis of the plan, we did a lot of work to really delve into and understand risk in this community and did a very comprehensive, probably one of the most comprehensive in the province's risk assessments to inform this work. So what we did is thought about that triangle, the hazard, where is all of those blue lines on the maps, and then considered all of the things that the community cares about that are in the way of that hazard. We did this for a number of what we call receptors of risk. We looked at lots of different things that were in the floodplains, but I'll just flash up a couple here today. So we looked at people. Obviously, people are the heart of the community. And in this case, we're just looking at residential units and residents in the floodplain. And in the present day, there are already about 300 people who reside in the floodplain. And as we look to the future with that changing flood hazard, even if no more people are put in the floodplain, if no more development is allowed in the floodplain, there will be almost 1,000 people in the floodplain going forward because of climate change and our changing flood hazard profile. Looking at another receptor that everyone can understand really quickly, financial losses. So we also took a look at the exposed value of buildings in the floodplain in the present day. This is $42 million. That's a fairly significant amount. I would highlight that that's not the total amount of the damage that would occur in the floodplain. You got to think about business disruption. You got to think about the loss of contents in these buildings and all of the other things associated with it. And so, a flood would actually potentially cost a lot more than $42 million, but it's a good indication. It gives you a direction of how much money this would cost. This is in the present day, and much like we look at people as we go into the future, this triples 3.5 or whatever that number is. It gets significantly larger as we go into the future, assuming today's land values, building values, et cetera. So it's a fairly significant problem today and will become a bigger problem into the future. And I encourage you to delve into the large tome should you want to find out how we calculated this, all of the assumptions we made, and we also did what we're called average annual loss calculations, so you can amortize these kind of numbers and support your decisions going forward. As we mentioned at the outset, though, we looked at lots of different things. We did work with the city as well as building on some of the CBRD work to understand what are the things that the community cares about that are in the floodplain. It is more than people and dollars. It's also the environment. There's a lot of ecological values, obviously, in the floodplain being a riparian area. There's a lot of, for example, contaminants in the floodplain, especially in the commercial and agricultural areas that could be released and further damage the environment. There are civic structures in the floodplain, and there is a fair number of critical infrastructure pieces, including things like lift stations and important arterial roads that are in the floodplain. And the story is pretty consistent that there is a risk present today, but a manageable risk. I think if there's a good news story here, but that into the future, this will get worse. And so I think the other key message here is that the risk will get worse in the future, regardless of the city's choices and decisions. I mean, I would encourage you to reduce your emissions and work hard on that side of climate change. But at the end of the day, the risk is going to get worse with climate change alone. And so there's an opportunity here for the city to make good decisions about the exposure and the vulnerability of what is in the floodplain. And that is well within the authority of the city to make those decisions. And so it's a good moment to make those good decisions before expanding that triangle even further. So once we had all of the information about the risk as part of this work, we started to look at solutions. How can we go forward and try and shrink that triangle as much as possible, which is obviously what you want to do, try and remove or reduce your risk. And to do that, because of the varied risk profile across the region, so there's different hazards, different depths of water, different lengths of time that they're here. There is also a different risk profile because some areas have more people or less people, or have more commercial and contaminants, or what have you. There's a very large diversity across the community. To attack this, we need a really large toolbox of actions that we can look at. So if we remember the triangle at the beginning in terms of our risk, there's levers on each side of that triangle that we can work with to try and reduce the risk. So we looked at the PERAR framework to kind of support this. So PERAR stands for protect. So those are the things you can do on the hazard side of the triangle to sort of reduce the power of the water or where it's actually going. Avoid, so you want to try and not increase your risk and grow your risk. So try and avoid putting things that you care about in the way of the water. We can accommodate. So these are things that we can do to live better with the water, changing the vulnerability, the bottom side of the triangle. And we can also look at managed retreat out of the highest risk areas. And then the sort of all-encompassing thing that we can look at is what we call resilience building. So these are all the actions we can take to recover more quickly from a flood event. These are sort of, neighborhood hubs, knowing your community, emergency response, all of these things. And the key here is that we really need to have a whole portfolio of tools to sort of chip away at the problem and apply the best tool in a specific area for a specific risk profile. So we had this huge portfolio and we had all of this information and we had to try and figure out a way to make sure that we were going through a robust and comprehensive decision analysis approach to make sure that we were choosing the best tool for each area, or best portfolio of tools for each area. And to do this, we adopted what's called structured decision-making, which is a large process in terms of gathering values, thinking about objectives, looking at risks, looking at the actions, how much does action X reduce the risk or improve the resilience, scoring all of these options on their ability to reduce risk, but also lots of co-benefits. Does this also add value to the ecological function of the river? Does this add value to the recreational values of the river? Is it cheap? Is it expensive? Looking at all of these things in a very systematic way in a review of the toolbox to determine which suite of tools would be most appropriate given the risk profile across the city. So that was the generalized approach that we took. And ta-da, 2 years of work and all of those steps. And we have a plan. This is the very high level summary of the plan that hopefully you have all looked up. Has everyone looked at it? I see no nods. Oh, thank you. All that hard work and no one read it. It's okay. I understand you have lots of other things to read too. But this is the sort of the culmination of all of that work and provides an overview of the recommendations that we have made. There's also a lot of specificity buried in the report that you can also look at if you want to. And this is really the vision for where the city can go with its flood management going forward. It provides like that big pathway. These are the things, like the next best steps that we think you should be taking to reduce your risk in the near term, as well as setting you up for some longer term big moves. So we're just going to run through a few top items here. So the management plan is set up with a bunch of citywide actions. So these are things that we are suggesting are applied citywide. And they are things that sort of apply regardless of the type of risk. And are going to work anywhere. And a lot of these are very low regrets or no regrets type actions. And then we also have some very detailed local specific actions, but I'm just going to give you a paint a picture of some of the citywide actions today. And so remembering our PERAR framework, we had a number of actions related to protect. So that's how we kind of control or move for the water. So we have, you can read them yourself. But obviously the city does currently have a number of what are called flood protection structures in different forms in terms of their legal status. And so we've got some specific recommendations around those. But I would like to highlight that we did look at them. We had civil engineers out looking at the riprap, the slope, and all of those details. And one of the appendices of the report is a dike master plan that provides very specific recommendations and guidance and status of all of those structures. We also have provided some specific recommendations around resilience building. And these are really the easy things that you can do that are going to support flood risk. They're also going to support you in all of those other hazards that you will face as a community, especially as climate is changing. Monitoring, warning, some of those things are going to be relevant for flood as they are for heat. And also sort of just communications and getting people to understand that this is an all of society problem. Everybody plays a role in reducing flood risk. And so the more you can help them understand that, the more action individuals can take, taking the burden off yourselves. So we have a number of recommendations under resilience building. Moving to avoid, so this is getting into the trickier territory for sure. We've got some specific actions. So like I highlighted at the beginning, there is a significant floodplain in the city, but in terms of the larger city area, it's not enormous. It's not 50% of your community. I don't actually know what the percentage is. It's probably closer to 10. And so everything you can do to avoid making that triangle bigger is something that I would highly recommend that you do through regulations and land use controls like risk-based zoning bylaw, trying to avoid putting more people. So like I showed you, like our estimates are you're going to have 1,000 people in the floodplain because of climate change in the coming years. If you do nothing, if you add people, you're going to have more risk into the future. I know there are competing pressures, and this is one of these awesome spaces of tensions and trade-offs to try and manage for that. We have got some ideas around that as well. But trying to avoid at least putting things that you care about the most in those areas that are the most dangerous. So what we call the floodway, so those deep, fast-moving areas. And then on the sort of moving to managed retreat, which sometimes feels very scary and overwhelming, but it is something that many communities in BC as well as around the world. I'm sure you'll see this in Florida next week after people are processing the hurricane, but just recognizing that, over the long term, in a very measured and careful way, managed retreat is like the best way to collapse that triangle. If you take away your exposure, you have no risk. And it's, quite easy, not easy to do, but it's very impactful if you work on the most at-risk properties, the most at-risk people. You can get a really big bang for your buck in terms of removing just a few homes. Obviously hugely challenging and shouldn't be taken lightly. And it's something that requires a lot of thought and consideration and time, as well as public communication. And there are communities that are actively doing this in the province right now. This is really where my heart lies. You can tell because there's way more bullets on here, more bullets than I normally put on a slide. Because I think this is a really good opportunity when we think about the triangle. Like we spent a lot of time in the last 70 or 80 years focusing on the hazards triad and trying to stop that water, which, we're failing at. We can't beat Mother Nature. Obviously exposure is difficult because your community has got roots in the floodplain, but living with water. So thinking about how we can change a little bit of our land use and our built form so that when the community does get wet, it is less damaged. Is a really good place to start because it's a tool that hasn't really been used very widely, but there's so much opportunity here. We provided quite a lot of specifics here around some permanent solutions as well as temporary flood barriers and solutions. Doing really simple fixes by working with your community, for example, to try and minimize the contamination sources that go out when there is a flood event. I don't know if you know, I think at the end of my presentation, I've got a picture that I took in Abbotsford in November 2021 when I was up in the helicopter. And there was two parts to the story there. You'll see it at the end. There was this sheen across the floodplain, and there was all of the farm equipment across the floodplain. And the hydraulic nerd in me was like, oh my gosh, I can see where the water's flowing. Like this is like model in action. And then most of me was crying, like really, actually, you can see me cry on national TV because the contamination that was coming out across those lands and into the river and destroying the habitat. So there are some really simple things you can do as a community to try and encourage folks to not keep their highly contaminated materials in the floodplain. So another area that we provided some focus on. And like I said, those are the citywide things. We also go down into the weeds, looking at different parts of the city that have a very different risk profile, either because the hazard's different. So that pink area, mostly coastal. So those are types of storms you get a little bit of warning for. They come in for a few days, you get up and down, but you also have a lot of wave and erosion action. And there's sort of a mix of residential, industrial along there. So that's one example, but you also have, highly industrial areas. You also have areas that have more residential. Anyway, so because of all of those differences in the risk profile, we provided very specific recommendations that are suited to each of those areas as part of the plan. And of course, you can always dive into the plan and see what those are. And that's just an example. I think that's local area 4 that I threw up on the slide there at a high level. So some specifics is, and some of those are short term and some of them are long term. And then finally, we're getting really close here to the end. One of the other things that is buried deep in the end of the report, so probably none of you got to chapter 8, which is where the real details are. Maybe you did, because personally I read chapter 1 and then I read last chapter. I don't read the middle, so maybe you do too. Anyway, so this is where the meat is in terms of making sure that, like I said at the beginning, we now really understand the problem. We have supported to help make some decisions, and now it's really time to act. And so this is your pathway, your future Bible for acting on these issues. So we've provided a timeline as well as ballpark costs for 86 different recommendations in the plan. And this is where I get to say goodbye to this and hand it over to city staff who can take each of these and determine which ones to move forward with going forward. But this is the recommendations from the consulting team. That is it, except for my picture with all of the oil. And cocaine, I would add, if you want your fun fact for the day. One of the major contaminants found in the Abbotsford floods was cocaine. Maybe I'll end there.
Fair enough. Thanks for that. And you said you're turning it back to staff. I'm wondering which. Janine, there we go.
Thanks, Tamsin. So with that, we'll open the floor to any questions from council.
There we go. Councillor Frisch.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor, and thanks for the presentation, Tamsin. Can you just refresh my memory? Midterm, was that 2100? Is that?
It's closer to 2050s, 2080s.
Hang on one second. I'll put your mic.
There we go. There we go. Okay, thank
There we
you.
go.
I pressed the button. Yeah, it's close to 2050, 2080s, and longer term, we're looking at about 100 years. So it's not that far away, like in terms of your planning horizons.
Excuse me, yeah. And so, there is some development pressure on our riverway. And I'm wondering, when you're looking at 2080 and some of those maps are showing buildings, I don't know what the flood level would be if it's a foot or 3 feet, but what are some of the risks for a building sitting in a floodplain next to a river? Even if it's built with garage space underneath, obviously everyone in the building isn't going to be going in and out of it for possibly a day or two at best. And beyond that, if the water is really retreating quick too at some point, then there's issues with the instability. So I don't know, what are your thoughts around?
Yeah, so my thoughts are that you should do your utmost to not put any other buildings and people in the floodway. And we do have actually I'll flip to this. I can't really see it very well, but in this map, we have specifically demarcated the light blue area from the dark blue area. So I can't see very well. The dark blue is the floodway. So that's the more dangerous area. So that's where you're going to experience deeper water, faster water. So when it comes to faster water, it's a lot more damaging. So it could damage a structure potentially, especially if it's not built to withstand it. So avoid as much as possible putting more residents in those areas or buildings. But if you look at the flood fringe, I think that's the area where you can start thinking about all of those accommodate options. So you can potentially have some residential in that area as long as you are building it thoughtfully. You're making sure that it is flood proof, that the main components of the building are elevated, that everybody in that building knows that they are in a flood fringe and that they will probably have to evacuate for whatever it is, 2 days a week. But that the intent there is that the building is structurally functional when they come back in a week. And so there is some room there in terms of developing and updating the bylaws to ensure that things are built to withstand a little bit of flooding and are recoverable after it. Whereas if you're in that floodway zone, that's where it becomes dangerous. And then you're dealing with, I'm looking at, I've got a fire chief here. So someone who's thinking about evacuations, that it's really dangerous to be in that area. And as you just noted, erosion is a big issue as well. So obviously the river naturally wants to move side to side, and that movement happens in those faster flowing areas. So
Right, and I
different
guess
types of risks.
the same would apply for the, excuse me, the 6th Street Bridge we're planning. And, the ends of that, especially the one near downtown, the side on the downtown side would be subject to quite, we saw it in 2014, where we were looking at the 5th Street Bridge thinking, well, geez, we wouldn't want any erosion at the ends of that. And it's even higher than 6th Street because it's been built up. So, yeah, food for thought on that. And then there's also in the report, it talked a lot about some of the development at the end of Anderton Ave. And I can't remember the name of the development in particular, but you know the one I'm talking about, the one that you couldn't get to the wall because of all the blackberries, I'm sure. Yeah, and can you just refresh my memory what some of the recommendations? I know it was debatable whether that's private property responsibility or provincial. We're hoping it's not ours, obviously.
Great. I might actually hand this one to Janine. Do I turn this off for you to go?
Through to Councillor Frisch, yes, for the Canterbury strata, we're looking to resolve that ownership dispute. And so the crux of the issue is that the development was built in 92 before the Dike Maintenance Act. And so since that Dike Maintenance Act, the province has sought to make the city responsible. And so it represents a large risk for the city, for the strata as well. And so to address that risk, it's proposed that we resolve that ownership dispute and ensure that the structure is repaired and maintained properly.
Right, so assuming it might fall on us, then we might be holding the bag on, is it creating a better dike? You talked about, I know there were a few suggestions and I can't remember which one was suggested, but it was quite elaborate.
There are trade-offs on both sides. At this time, it's not proposed that we build a larger structure by any means, but it is proposed that as a follow-up action, we look to resolve the dispute and then continue to manage it from there. So the primary function of the structure is erosion protection with a little bit of flood protection. It's not designed to meet the Q200 provincial expectations of the present day. And so it's a matter of doing our best with what we have.
Yeah, and I guess
addressing
we're
that risk.
assuming we have a bit of time here, like present day, not a huge risk, it looks like, so. We got 50 years to figure it out, is what we're thinking, maybe?
We
Or
hope so.
less, or possibly less.
And I think Mr. Garbutt had a comment.
Yeah, through the mayor to Councillor Frisch, I just wanted to let council know that the management of the floodplain has been a very important role for the city of Courtenay, stretching back many years. And as Ms. Tezioli was speaking, we've had varying flood protection bylaws and standards in place, and some of our stratas actually even straddle different elevations through that point. Ms. Wade's department's responsibility is to ensure that we manage risk, develop in a best practice standard, and those are all attached to our development approvals. Sometimes it's in rezoning conditions, sometimes in building permit conditions, sometimes it's in floodplain relaxation. So this is a great comprehensive framework for us to move it together, but we every day and have for the last 50 years in Courtenay had to address this situation. And now this kind of gives an overall approach for us to work together. But just to go to your question, how do we manage those risks? That's the responsibility of Ms. Wade's department, and it happens multiple ways through multiple approval processes. And we'll continue to do that, and this work will help support that.
Yeah, thanks for the perspective, and I'm just really happy to be having the conversation. I realize that there's, and in reality, that's more complicated than being, black and white decisions. So thank you.
And Councillor Frisch and Councillor Hillian.
Thanks, Mayor, and thanks very much for the level of work that's involved in this approach. A number of us were in this room last Thursday for a regional climate action workshop, and we had a presentation by Zoom from the Mayor of Merritt. And he spoke in detail about the impact of the catastrophic flood that they had in 2021. And they still have, I believe, over 100 people who are out of their houses and haven't been able to get back in. The impact, it was very, it was palpable the way he described it. And a couple of the issues that come up for me, one is related to personal insurance and the issue of overland flooding, which apparently a lot of people's flood insurance does not cover. And I mean, that's a reality that we're talking here about overland flooding. So when we talk about resilience building and communicating with our populace, that's one of the issues I think we need to highlight for people. There's also a line in there about talking to insurance companies. I'm not sure what we're going to talk to them about, but because I mean, I'm not convinced about the goodwill that's always apparent there. But the thing that I think might be missing, he also spoke about the challenge of waiting for disaster response from senior governments. And I'm wondering to what extent our plan is going to address advocacy and the need to, it does talk about emergency preparedness, but it seems to me that there's a pretty big advocacy piece to improve the provincial and federal responses and awareness of the impacts of these catastrophic floods, and how we might get a better response that would better protect our citizens in the inevitable event that we're dealing with this somewhere down the road.
Thank you, Councillor Hillian. Yeah, I can address, I think, 3 things there quickly. Yeah, thank you. And I'm I guess thrilled, but also saddened that you spoke with the Mayor of Merritt. But I think hearing those stories is so impactful to understand what might happen in your own community and how others are still struggling with it today. On the issue of insurance, yes, we do have some specific recommendations around that. We did look into it was quite a long time ago now, so we didn't update it on the timeline of the project, but we did look into the availability of private insurance in in the city of Courtney, and it was available at the time through Cooperators, Intact, and a few others in terms of overland insurance. So we need to, I think it's one of the recommendations to sort of revisit that and see if that is still the case. I would also add that the federal government is in the midst of evolving their private sort of, or I guess, the private insurance side of the public insurance side of things for disaster financial assistance arrangements. And those are now just sitting over in Victoria for review. But once those are all laid out, it's a very different landscape. They're modeling it on a whole different way of doing things about sort of addressing the highest risk properties first. So as you see that come out, there will be some public communications, which I think is the other piece I'd like to highlight, is that we had a lot of recommendations in this report about making people aware of insurance, for example, suggesting that they buy it, and sort of building on and maybe taking advantage of any public communications that come out as the federal and the provincial government to change their role in the public disaster financial assistance. So it is something that I think is really important, that there is that residual risk. No matter how much you try and reduce that triangle, there's going to be a part of that triangle left, and you can kind of work on making people financially whole through insurance. In terms of supporting you to advocate and not waiting for a disaster response, one of the other recommendations that we have buried deep in here might be like in the 80s, so probably no one got down to it, was the development of a post-disaster plan. And that specifically is a plan you would have in place before a disaster happened. And it's not about the emergency management and the response and the evacuation or even the immediate recovery, but it's that long-term thinking of how can we build back better? We're going to have our plans in place in advance of that event so that when the event happens and the federal government and so on are standing here, commiserating as they do on television, you will have the plan ready to go, and you will have already communicated with your citizens of what that might mean. That might be the moment to do some of those really difficult managed retreats. But if you've had that conversation in advance and it's got it ready just after the disaster occurs, when the coffers are open federally and provincially, it's a good way to take advantage of those dollars. So, and then on top of that, there are a number of other elements throughout around advocacy. And I think Janine and staff have been very good at working with provincial staff and what are called the diodes, the deputy inspectors of dikes, to understand how things are moving and what that means to the community, as well as relaying some of the challenges that you are facing as a community in regulating or changing the way you're doing things or accessing provincial or federal funds. I think there is a lot buried in here, and I think a lot of that is actually underway, and your staff has been working on that diligently for the last couple of years.
I appreciate hearing that, and I do confess that I didn't read in detail all
You didn't
10
get the 80s?
attachments. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Councillor Hillian, and Mike, the mayor of Merritt. I mean, he also had some frustration around on the subject of insurance companies who just went bankrupt, and I know speaking with the mayor of Lytton also when they had their fires, that interaction with senior levels of government is frustrating at best, I would say. So yeah, appreciate the comments. Councillor McCollum.
Oh, thanks, Mayor, and thanks for the presentation. And it was a lot of material to go through, but we have been kind of getting this in pieces for quite some time. It's been a accumulation of a lot of work. Yeah, I guess I had a couple questions, and I'm not sure if they would be for you or for staff, so I'll just fire away. One is about how you're speaking to like contamination risk and those kind of sources that can really add to the environmental impacts after a flood. And to me, an obvious one is stored fuel. I think that's kind of what you were referring to, which makes sense in an agricultural area, that you would see a lot of that. And of course, we have an agricultural area right in the midst of this map that we're looking at. We also have 2 old gas stations. I think both of them are now out of service. And my question is, do we have the ability to really regulate what people are storing and how they're using those properties? Because that seems like a major challenge, is that you know, it's last minute, basically. Sometimes the notice is only 12 hours maybe. So just wondering, like, as policymakers, how we address that.
Thanks, Councillor McCollum. To your question about contamination risk and regulation. So the hazardous materials storage guidelines are provincial, but I think we have an opportunity to proactively communicate with businesses and residents within our community, making them aware of that risk and encouraging storage measures that could resist flood event. So that could be things like double wall tanks, gaskets on underground storage tanks, things like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess one other question that I had around this is that, you know, when we have a fuel storage that ceases to operate, I know from, you know, other stories that I've heard in the province that sometimes that fuel is left there. And I'm wondering, you know, as things turn over, people don't realize that they sometimes have stored fuel on the ground, and whether or not, again, as a municipality, we have any way of addressing that, or if that, again, is really the provincial government that oversees that type of oversight.
Great question. I think that our jurisdiction on private property is limited. So that it comes to a point of collaboration, a point of awareness, ensuring that the provincial regulations are upheld, and working with a province if enforcement may be needed.
That's helpful. And then just another quick question, circling back to the comment that Councillor Frisch made earlier around that dike that it's not really completely clear who's currently responsible, and something that the Mayor of Merritt highlighted when he was speaking to kind of how things could have been mitigated in some ways leading up to their disastrous flood event, that trees in some of their earth dikes should have probably been removed, and that they weren't being maintained properly because there was no expertise, and because that, you know, that responsibility had then transferred to a small municipality without that expertise. And I guess my question is, while this process is working its way out, are we ensuring that at least there is some eyes on the maintenance side, and that we're not overlooking an existing risk while we're getting through this process?
Great question, Councillor McCollum. We do annual inspections that are required under the Dike Maintenance Act. And so as part of that, we note any deficiencies. So one of the deficiencies that has been noted is vegetation along the dikes. And this raises a unique question for us because, as you noted, best practices are to remove that vegetation. However, vegetation also, its roots can offer some stabilization to banks and slopes. And so we have structures that are considered dikes by definition, but they really offer erosion protection. They're not much higher than the height of land, and so their flood protection is limited, but their erosion protection is quite significant. And so this relates to one of our protect recommendations, where we want to clarify provincial expectations for vegetation management on dikes that offer erosion protection. So once we get that clarification, we'll ensure that our maintenance program is aligned with that. That may see the removal of vegetation, or perhaps we're able to maintain certain kinds of vegetation because of the stability benefits they offer.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I'm glad to hear that that's already being worked on. I was actually surprised to hear that trees along a shoreline would be an added risk. That was news to me. So that was one of the things I learned last week, and now I've also learned something new. So thank you.
Thanks, Councillor McCollum. And next we have Councillor Cole Hamilton.
Thanks, Mayor, and thanks so much for this report. I know it's an opus and it's been a long time coming, but there's a lot to deal with. One observation is we were just on the point of insurance earlier. One of the other comments the Mayor Merritt made is, while overland flood insurance was available, he said it was going to be $1,400 a month, and so he opted, if you want to call it opting it, for self-insuring and just having to just deal with what happens. So it may still be available here, but may be a challenge. I wanted to ask a little bit about the Lewis Dike. Obviously, we're removing the Anderson Dike, but I noticed that the Lewis Dike that was listed as a long. First thing we should do is repair it and remediate it, and then in the longer term, consider rewilding or the shore there. And I was wondering if you could walk me through the thinking of why it is that we'd want to wait before. Why does it want to repair the existing dike rather than perhaps rewilding as we're doing on the other side of the river?
Maybe quickly on the insurance and the financial piece there. Yeah, it can be prohibitively costly.
Yeah.
And if it's available, you don't buy it, then you don't get disaster financial assistance. So it is a bit of a challenge.
Yeah.
But that is the piece that the new disaster financial assistance arrangements are trying to address. So they're developing what's called a sort of flood reprogram, where there will be a backstop for those people who, like, where it becomes unaffordable, there will be a subsidized affordable option provided by the federal government. So as we move forward, we don't know where it's at yet, and we're still waiting for those details to be finalized. There is some hope that there's a measure there to manage for folks who can't actually pay for the true cost of living in the floodplain, I might add. And then with regards to Lewis Dike, I think the reasoning there was really just around prioritization and practicalities, and recognizing that there are other areas of the city that are in greater need of an immediate action. And that, as Janine was just saying, the Lewis Park Dike is not so much a dike as an erosion protection feature. And so right now it's just holding up the edge there. And so if it's not repaired, there is a chance that it will not continue to hold up that edge and you will lose some of the land. So that was the sort of the reasoning behind that. And then just being realistic about timelines to restore and naturalize areas, and that there would be a lot of difficult community conversations around the trade-offs between the recreational space and the river space. But it was more of a longer term strategy. I don't know, do you want to add anything there?
I think you've done a good job covering it. Lewis Park Dike is in our long-term plans, but it does offer a lot of community recreational value. And so with that in mind, we want to be sure that we can leverage lessons from the Anderton Dike naturalization before we take on a much bigger project. And we want to maintain that erosion protection. We do have a lot of infrastructure within Lewis Park. And so if it were to experience erosion without that protection there, we might see damages that we didn't expect. And so we want to be careful about managing that.
Okay, I did have another question. It's on a completely different topic. Well, it's on this topic, but it's a different aspect of it. So perhaps I'll
leave it up to you.
Okay, well, maybe I'll just one of the, when I think it's the Canterbury Dike, when there was one of the models showed what would happen if it was hardened, and there was concern then about, I believe it was called shifting the risk to IR2, the Comox First Nation. And obviously, like the river being the boundary between the two, there's like an extreme proximity and impact of almost everything we do would have an impact on them. And it seems like there were challenges in getting doing consultation with KFN at this point, but I would imagine part of the ongoing process would be very engaged discussions with anyone who, any entity, especially KFN, who's would be impacted by, as you said, water knows no boundaries. And if we try to keep it out of one place, then it ends up going to another place. So I imagine that's been a challenge in other communities as well. And is there a best practice for making sure one's working collaboratively with neighbors and not, as you said, shifting the risk?
Yeah, so you've just named, I think, about 3 or 4 of the 10 golden rules of flood management. One of them being no risk transfer, and I think you got that. So that it is really important, I think. And as soon as you start hardening and squishing your river up through infrastructure, obviously you're moving that risk somewhere else that you want to avoid, especially if it's to a neighbor. And another big part of golden rule is definitely a good collaborative from the ground up approach. And it was certainly our hope that that would be the case for this project. Obviously capacity challenges, but there is a growing relationship. I would say that one of the other things that the city is partnering on with the CVRD is this is outside the scope of this project, but we're working on a project with the Comox Valley Regional District to develop an MOU with Comox Nation, CVRD, and yourselves, as well as City of Comox, on how to move forward on flood projects and water management projects in general from a sort of process and collaborative perspective. So a lot of thought has gone into that in terms of best practice, and that is going to be applied in the next 6 months or so for the Comox road area in terms of a decision going forward. So I think there is actually a pretty good model that's actually here, just hasn't been executed yet, but absolutely, it's really important. I would also highlight that EDMA, so the new legislation that came into force, references and obviously is steeped in DRIPA. So that relates to relationship with Indigenous peoples, and that both of those will both, sort of require, and I think in your hearts, you want to do it anyways, collaboration and meaningful and proper collaboration with your neighbors. And there are some recommendations from a consultant perspective in the report that relate to working on that relationship. And I don't know if Janine has anything to add in the practicalities of that from a city staff perspective.
I'll just reiterate that our proposed recommendations do not transfer risk. And so we are not going to be making flooding worse in any other area. We're seeking to make space for the river and ensure that the depth of water is lower than it is currently. That would be, good flood risk management. In regarding the Comox First Nation, they did attend some of our working groups as part of this project. And I think that there's an opportunity to identify solutions together because they do have a lot of areas along the shoreline that they have an interest in. And so that includes following their CHIP permit, identifying any Indigenous sites that may be at risk, and continuing that conversation with them.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate those final comments, Janine. Okay, thanks, Mayor.
Thanks, sir. Councillor Cole Hamilton and Councillor Moore.
Great, thank you, Mayor. Yeah, it was a lot of information to absorb, but as people mentioned, we have been following along with this for quite a while. So it was good to kind of refresh some of the material that we've been receiving and seeing it all together. So a couple things. First of all, the 86 actions, it sounds overwhelming, but there are some things that are already underway, and there are things that don't involve, a ton of work. So I think it's a reasonable list. I don't think it's quite as overwhelming as it looks. Obviously, some recommendations will be tougher, more challenging than others. So one question I have is, we do, even this week, we received some correspondence with confusion about why we're allowing development in some parts of the floodplain and not others. And so I guess I'm wondering if that will be something that will be covered in the overall communication plan, or how we're going to kind of clarify that with the public, because, they see, as Councillor Frisch mentioned, they see development along the river, and then there's other parts that we say no to or whatever. So that's my first question.
Through to Councillor Morin. I think that we will build that clarity through a couple of bylaw updates. And so it's proposed that we update the zoning bylaw. It's proposed that we update the floodplain management bylaw. It's also proposed that we develop a DPA for the flood hazard area as well. And so we're currently working with regulatory tools that have not been informed by the latest and greatest flood hazard information. And so once we adopt this plan, we're able to integrate it into our bylaw framework. We'll see some clarity with the development community as well as the public. And then to your point around how do we further clarify, that's where our comprehensive public communication plan comes in. So that would involve messages that apply to landowners, messages that apply to those interested in development, messages that apply to newcomers to our community. And so there's a number of different audiences that may have a different interest when it comes to reducing the impact of flood on their property.
Great, thank you. And, having gone through this recently with construction of my own, and there is still a lot of confusion, and there's a lot of, this wasn't with the city, but it's confusing. And I think for people who are in those existing properties that maybe want to do a renovation, or they want to add a carriage house or whatever, I think they're in for a real shock, because they're going to need to do some major adaptation to be able to, if at all, be able to build in those areas. But I guess that kind of brings me to my main comment and question, which is around the sort of human impact, which Councillor Hillian touched on. And it's live this week. We're seeing it in the news. There are many people who are not able to evacuate, or they're not able to have their needs met in these circumstances. I was talking to a friend, or not talking to, but I heard from a friend who had met someone, I guess in an airport or something, and the person's mother perished because they were out of town, and the elderly person was in the home on her own, and no one was able to get her out. And I think, and I think that was a family that had some means. So we know that in the 2014 scenario, our most vulnerable citizens were in the middle of the worst of it. So I know that we have under resilience building, updating the emergency response plan. I'm wondering if we're going to get a little bit more detail about that particular section, which to me is huge. Post-disaster plan is important, but I think for those folks that are extremely vulnerable, and there's many of them. If we look at the development along the river right now, we have like multiple seniors living along there. And it's folks with financial challenges, people who are more frail, all of that. So I think we could come up with this communication plan and send all this information out. It's overwhelming. People are getting information about the heat domes and how to keep themselves safe. There's no COVID right now, hopefully. But there's always something that people have to prepare for. And it's completely overwhelming. Okay, you've got your earthquake quick. Now I have to worry about flooding. So is there a way that we can have a communication plan that's more human, more personal? And I like the idea of actually having neighborhood meetings where neighbors can say, I can help you out with this, or where there's, just kind of more collective care for each other. So I'm just wondering if any of that's been factored in, or how we're tackling that kind of
Mr.
emergency
Garber's got a
response.
comment.
Yeah, thank you. Through the mayor to Councillor Moran, very, very timely, giving all the things that are happening, and obviously our thoughts go to the families and people adversely impacted in the southeastern United States. So our involvement in the Comox Valley Emergency Management Program is very strong. Chief McDonald is our representative on that. We were just talking about engagement on our planning for emergency response. So 2 items. We have an active floodplain management program that has been led in the past based on previous. It will be informed by this work that's been done and information. The staff that are related to the emergency program are actually doing community emergency response meetings. I happen to attend one in my neighborhood. So we have our own plan together. So those things that you're talking about, that community resiliency, and I understand the policy group is going to get an update in the next few months from an emergency program. So it's critical that we have a response plan, and the program will communicate out of it. There are tools for neighborhoods to get together to respond, as well as the BC Emergency Management System has guidelines for people for 72 hours of support. So there's a lot of stuff there. So this is a technical document related to management of floodplain. There are a lot of resources available, and I'm very impressed with the work that emergency program has been doing, and I wanted to acknowledge Chief McDonald as our leader in that regard. And if people want information, we have information on our website as well as on the CVRD website about neighborhood emergency preparedness response planning programs. A lot of words in there. And so if you as council are engaged by that, we can get people engaged with that, and we redistribute information from the emergency program. There'll be seasonal readiness stuff that'll happen as the weather changes, but I really appreciate that question, because it's really important work that's underway in parallel or in support of this work. This is a little bit more technical. The work in the emergency program is more response and communicative.
And I think just a quick follow-up that it would be great to have sort of a champion in every neighborhood, because there's many people living alone that, I mean, we can have a neighborhood plan, but if you're more isolated, you're not necessarily going to be part of that plan. So unless someone's actually kind of taking you under their wing. I found it interesting with what's happening down south that we don't have a bunch of prisons here, but apparently they're not evacuating prisons. They're just moving them to the second floor, which, just really speaks to, I think, the value of human life and institutions. I mean, hospitals, it's difficult to evacuate. So yeah, I just found that very striking, that there's certain lives that just don't seem to be valued as much. But, intentionally or not, I think we need to look at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Moran, and Councillor Jolicoeur.
Thanks, Mayor. I have to admit, it took me 4 goes to get through the whole plan. I may have fallen asleep the first 2 times. Not because it wasn't stimulating, just because it was so detailed, and but I did appreciate the appendices, the multiple appendices, most of which had photos, because that made it an easier read. Yeah, I just want to say thank you for the staff team who was leading this, and the technical advisor group and community members who participated in the survey. This is kind of all hands on deck, obviously from the staff report and from the plan. So well done. And one of the things, just to kind of loop back on 2 of my colleagues' comments previously related to KFN, one of the things that I'm curious to know if we can expand their involvement beyond this CHIP, Cultural Heritage Permitting process, to some of the other recommendations related to retreat and the acquisition of undeveloped land in the floodplain. There wasn't language around their involvement in that, but I think that would also mean I appreciate that you've spoke to DRIPA and our relationship to DRIPA and our commitments to that as a corporation, as a municipality. I'd like to see them potentially be invited into some of those other activities and recommendations. And then in terms of the neighborhood plan, I was excited to see that we're going to be exploring hubs, because I think that aligns with our council's strategic priorities around imagining what stronger local area plans could look like. So I'm excited to see what that rolls out. I guess 2 kind of buckets of questions to start with. One being, and I appreciate if we go back to the slide with the colorful table, the one that had the sources of contaminants, and I'm curious, this is probably for our consultant, but am I understanding it correctly that not all contaminant sources are equal in their impact to the environment? And in looking at the map for both the flood fringe area and then the floodway, there are in fact a few gas stations, both the Cardlock on the east side of Cliff and then Lower Rhine Road. And I'd be curious to know is there an approach that we should be taking, a unique approach to managing those contaminant sources differently dependent on the potential impact both on the environment and to people, based on the type of source that they are?
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Julie Kerr. Yes, we don't have that specificity in the report, but it certainly exists in the many spreadsheets and GIS files that supported this work. So we do identify what contamination sources we are looking at, noting that we only know the ones that we know are there, and there's probably a lot of unknown contamination sources as well. So this is just really a starting point. And then we provide some recommendations about, how to, in general, there is room to better manage, probably through education, these contamination sources. And I think there needs to be more thought put into sort of how to target that. But you're absolutely right. The different types of contamination, and also like where's your biggest or your easiest place to reduce that risk, right? So some of these things are going to be really easy to manage by just tying down and putting caps on them. But something like a gas station is a much more complicated prospect. So they need different ways to approach it. So that's not specifically in the plan for sure, but if you need that information, it is buried in the details. And I think it's sort of one of those things to think about when you move forward, when you're actually taking this vision and getting into the details.
Again, just seems like everyone got 2 questions, and so I'll get my other one in, which the other bucket of curiosities that I had was around the costing. And I appreciate on page 5 of the staff report and in your presentation, you spoke about the costs of not doing something, which I really appreciate, at 42 million for a present day flood and 140 million for a future flood event, in terms of financial loss to the community. And I appreciate that you spoke to that, because I think that's really helpful. And we see that in the survey from the public as well. They're concerned about that. And so this might be more for staff, but in the chapter 8 of the plan, it speaks to the annualized and the short term, and the intermediate and the long term, both in terms of the operational just activities of our different divisions at the city, but also in terms of capital projects. And I'm wondering if we have a general sense of, at least in that 5-year plan, what we're thinking some of the costs will be. And I guess the caveat to that is that I note that in a few of the areas, the work in the immediate is to do work to figure out how much things will cost. And in particular, I will note some, I guess, just concerns around what that dollar figure will be as it relates to civic facilities. It looks like we've costed a few $1,000s to do the assessments, the investigations for each of those facilities. So I'm wondering if we have a ballpark number to think about what the total cost it will take for us to truly protect and make our community more resilient relative to the what we do, how much it will cost if we don't do anything.
He's taking this one.
Yes, great question. I see that Chris Davidson has his hand raised virtually. So before I jump in, I'd like to give him a chance to respond.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for the question, Councillor Jolicoeur. Through the CAO to Mayor and Council, yes, we do have a general idea of costing. So as you see in the report, there's considerations for some projects laid out. I would highlight those are high-level cost estimates. Each of those initiatives would require further study to understand better exactly what the cost might be. As far as costs in the near future over the next 5-year plan, yes, we do have some flood management projects on the capital plan. Of course, there's the Anderson Dike, and we're looking at some maintenance works as well. Total costs for those are in the nature of, I recall, $10 to $15 million over the next 5 years. Speaking to the long term, how do we manage these significant costs for protecting the community or avoiding the floods going forward? It's really an asset management question. So as we continue to develop our asset management program and work to put funds away, planning for the future, this will have to be considered along with some of the other priorities facing the community, water, sewer, transportation, other things that are impacting the community and will require asset management. I hope that's answered the question.
And to that, I'll also add that some of these costs represent new projects. Some of them represent work underway, and some of them are things that we do that we might just do differently. And so when we say 10 to 15 million, it may not be new costs that you've never seen. This could be integrated with our plan. So it's proposed that once adopted, staff will take this away, work to integrate it into our work plans, and then present those costs as part of the 5-year financial plan and city's routine budget process.
Excellent. That sounds great. Thanks for that. And we have Councillor McCollum.
Yeah, thanks. That was actually covered a lot of the question that I had. And then so maybe just picking up on that, that it will come back to us. And I mean, because the implementation in the report says it's mostly in the 5-year timeline as well. So that does kind of ladder in nicely with how we do our financial planning. And so I guess my question is just how we'll refer back to this. Like it's been a long process getting here, and then we have this implementation process, and things often do take a little bit longer than we first envisioned for a variety of reasons, including trying to get grant funding for some of the work. So just wondering how staff expect to kind of bring this back as we move through it, and the check-in with just the implementation of some of these actions, and recognizing what you've said, that there are some kind of ongoing pieces and even some items that we've already discussed, but is now being formalized in what we have in front of us.
Great question, Councillor McCollum. I could see some of this integrating with our corporate climate action work. So this plan represents climate adaptation, preparing for the climate of the future. And so when we're looking at the city's progress on climate action, that would include resilience measures as well as mitigation measures. And so perhaps we could develop some metrics as part of that climate action plan to give the community a report out on our progress to address the flood risk, among other risks that we may face as a community.
I think that makes a whole lot of sense. I'm glad to hear that's the approach that we're going with. Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor McCollum, and Councillor Cole Hamilton.
Thanks, Mayor. I just wanted to ask one other question about sort of next steps. And I noticed that in the scoping of this, that pluvial flooding, like from rain and stormwater, are not included in this. And obviously, there's going to be overlap between those, and it speaks in the report of combining those two master plans. I guess it's probably for staff, but I know we've been expecting that stormwater management plan for a while. I can't remember what the sort of delivery date is of that, but I assume that we'll receive a sort of combined report, which probably will have have some changes from this, because it'll be adding in that extra dimension of water risk. So I guess I was just wondering when the stormwater management plan was due and when we'd see that combination happening.
To Councillor Will Cole Hamilton, we are planning to deliver that to council later this fall. And I will note that although both the IRMP, Integrated Rainwater Management Plan, and the Flood Management Plan address the risk of flooding, it's the hazard is very different. So in the case of stormwater, flooding occurs because our pipes are not built large enough, or we have too much volume of rainwater. And that can occur anywhere, even far from our rivers and our coastline. Whereas this project really assesses the risk related to the dynamic nature of rivers and coastline. So the two of those plans together manage the full spectrum of flood risk.
Okay, and they'll be combined, but obviously like rain events and storms and this type are often coincide, so we might be looking at it, the combined impacts of both if an event occurred.
Yes, and to clarify, the flood maps that we've seen evaluate the combined probability of sea level rise at a future time, as well as heavy rainfall events. And so we've considered that combined probability because we are an estuary community. It's often that we get our greatest flood events when high tides combine with large rainfall events. So that has been considered.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Cole Hamilton, and Councillor Frisch.
Thanks. So point of clarification for the Huntledge area, is it suggested that it's going to be more reasonable to protect that area than to consider retreating from it. I mean, obviously, we're trying to avoid putting more stuff in those areas, but considering there's all this stuff down there, I see all the recommendations are more about protecting it. So could you comment on that?
First, I'd like to clarify which Puntledge area.
Puntledge, yeah, good
Puntledge
point.
Industrial.
Puntledge Industrial, yeah. Like, yeah, Puntledge Road area, Lewis Park area.
So for the Puntledge Road area, we are not seeking to build any additional dikes. So we have some structures that are considered dikes already. And so for those areas, we want to reduce the risk by ensuring everybody is aware of it, building our critical infrastructure to resist, and developing a managed retreat plan. So in some cases, there could be land uses that remain and are well adapted. And in other cases, that may look like revised land use over time. But the recommendation is to develop a managed retreat strategy. And so it is would include a lot of stakeholder engagement with the community, and building a vision for what that may look like.
Yeah, well, thanks for clarifying that for me. And then you mentioned, or there was mention of government funding, and I'm just wondering if we know of a big pot of money, or if there's, maybe it's being contemplated. Any thoughts on that? And of course, that's politically affected and can be a different government in power. So I guess we might not be able to just sit back and wait for the province to tell us to do something and offer a bunch of money. So what are your thoughts on how much money is going to be available?
Maybe field this one. Yeah, it's a moving landscape, absolutely. And so I think what we have done is maybe we don't know what those funding programs are, although we have identified some, and some applications have gone into things like federal DMAF and the provincial DRIF program. What this project aimed to do was really align it with those future funding programs so that when those grants are available, this is like ready and waiting, and it's going to tick all those boxes in terms of meeting the expectations and the evaluation criteria. I may have designed some of them, so you've got a little bit of an in here in terms of those provincial and federal funding programs. So I think that is a sort of a good place for this to be. But to your point, and maybe Janine can answer this one better. It is a bit dangerous waiting for granting programs. They come and they go. We had a terrible period. Now we're in a period of plenty, or we have been for the last 2 or 3 years when it comes to programs to support these kind of actions. Who knows what we're going to face in the next few months here, provincially and federally. But I think Janine might have some comments on how to manage that internally.
And Mr. Garbutt had a comment as well.
Thanks. Just through the mayor to council, we had some meetings at UBCM. We asked a specific question about funding availability. We got some good direction. We will be preparing applications when the time is right. The staff will be making a presentation to Comox First Nation Chief and Council tomorrow. Yes, tomorrow. The mayor is accompanying with that to talk about the program, understand potential alignment, what the interests are in this floodplain, and seeking if there is some potential for any partners at the time. And so this is the critical first step to come forward with a plan. We'll further develop that, and we will take action on potential grant opportunities based on the information that we received. The information that we heard at UBCM was that there are varying, to echo our consultant, there are federal programs, there are provincial programs, and there's a UBCM managed program. There's going to be annualized flood funding as recognized through UBCM and the provinces is an extremely important matter. The previous funds were way oversubscribed, and so having a good, tight, well-organized plan will assist us in that regard, and then building some partnerships. I think the potential to look in shared interest, which may be the regional district, it may be First Nations, is absolutely critical. And the leadership that has been shown in the Valley to model this, take action, and then there's demonstration of really good discussion, good approvals and good actions that show we have a strong commitment, including the Anderton, the investment that the municipality has done in the Anderton area to manage this issue. And as well, the Couscoussum renovation or restoration is another one. So we've been identified as a place that is walking the walk. And so we'll continue to do that. And we're very hopeful that grants assist that. And I would acknowledge that relying on grants may have some risk, but it's also a good way to help us pay for these really important activities.
Yeah, that certainly is helpful, or hopeful, sorry. But I guess it's safe to assume that there won't be enough money to complete all the things we wish to complete. So it's never too early to start saving and planning. So thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Frisch. And yeah, I mean, a lot of work's been done on the avocation side of it. And then, of course, Modi would be another partner, especially because there's a little road in there that they're kind of responsible for. I'll pass it over to Councillor Jolicoeur.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. My other set of questions, kind of going back to Councillor McCollum's original question around how we can encourage and support, and I heard from staff that's an educational approach. One of the accommodation recommendations is around groundwater wells, and there's others around the safeguarding or the storage of contaminants. And so I just want to clarify that I heard this correctly. Like, beyond education, there is no best practice around incentivization, whether it be financial incentivization or the inclusion of specific language in bylaws that we would be able to restrict certain activities on private property, whether they be commercial private property or residential private property. That wasn't clear, because in some of the recommendations under floodplain bylaw updates, it speaks to some of that. And so I just want to make sure I have, and I know that will come, the floodplain bylaw will come, and we'll probably have our development services team explain that really clearly to us, but I just want to make sure I understand.
Just maybe I can add my 2 cents as the consultant on this. This would be the first time this would be applied. So it was something that we suggested, and our planner who was working with us on this project suggested as an opportunity to try and test this out, but it really needs to go through all of those steps to understand whether it is actually enforceable, doable, all of those things. There, to my knowledge, and I have actually read nearly every floodplain bylaw in the province, there is no bylaw that currently has contamination within it, but there are a few other communities that are also exploring this. Did I mention cocaine? That are also looking at different ways to manage this through regulation. So although as far as I know, the tool isn't there yet, I think there might be an opportunity to explore and sort of push some boundaries, but obviously looking at the planners in the room and those that would actually have to figure out the details and the lawyers and all of those pieces to see if it would actually be possible. But from a consultant point of view, I would love you to be the community I use as an example in all those other communities going forward, but you guys did it successfully.
Yeah, we're usually up for a challenge, so
Okay.
I can't accept the challenge on behalf of all of council, but yeah, thanks for that. I do have one more clarification question.
I see the floor is open.
On the pool. So switching topics, I note that the pool recommendation was separated out from the Lewis Park Civic Facilities Assessment. And they were also separated into different sections. The Lewis Park Civic Facilities was under flood proofing. And so am I correct to think that there is no way to flood proof the pool, and that's why it was in accommodate or relocate?
Well, as council is aware, we're currently evaluating the options for Memorial Pool. And so all of the options that we consider will be informed by the flood hazard data that we have available. And so flood pools are designed to hold water without damage. However, there's a lot of mechanical components The pool is also a source of contamination with our chlorine that's stored in the buildings. And so I think there's a number of ways that we could address that risk. But because the nature of the pool is much different than the Lewis Center, which is a building, we had different line items for the recommendations.
All right, thanks for that. And I guess most of the questions that I had actually were answered quite well. So I really appreciate that. I have one question and I'll pass it right over to you. My question, I think, is really just around terminology and the concept of, making sure we have good communication. And where I get a little nervous around terminology, and when we say flood proof versus, flood resilient, or, that kind of, like those kinds of languages, because proof kind of is pretty high bar in my mind. So I just wonder with that terminology, the level of confidence that goes along with it. I worked in technology, so we had fool resistant things, but foolproof was sometimes a little bit more difficult. So
Yeah, you're speaking to my heart. Yeah, for sure. I also struggle with some of the terminology that we use that people understand, like even protect. I prefer to use defend because it feels like you might fail, whereas protect less so. Yeah, it's a really important distinction. We're just kind of using the words that are generally applied. So if you go online and type in flood proofing, you're going to get a bunch of different books for like Flood Proof My Home. You'll get a bunch of different guidelines and things. If you do Flood Resilience My Home, you're going to get nothing. So that's kind of, I think we have to walk that line of communicating exactly what it is, and that it's not going to make you invincible. It's going to reduce your risk, but also making it sort of understandable by the public. And so we're constantly walking that line when we're in this sort of very complicated world. But it's a really good flag, and I'm sure we're all writing it down, and it'll be part of that communications plan, is recognizing language is important.
awesome. That was it. Thanks, Councillor Hilling.
Thanks, Mayor. I'll move that council adopt the flood management plan and direct staff to implement the 86 recommended actions and include budget for related projects in the 5-year financial plan.
All right, it's been moved and seconded. Any further questions or comments before I call the vote? Seeing none. All those in favor? And motion carries. Excellent. Thanks again so much for the presentation and all the answers. It's been very enlightening. Really appreciate it.
Your attention. Go home. We're trying.
Fantastic. All right, next we have the Comox First Nation Fire Protection Agreement, and maybe I'll just pass it over to staff.
Thank you through the mayor to council. Staff report before you is seeking support from council to direct staff to enter into an agreement with Comox First Nation to provide fire protection at the Penledge Indian Reserve number 2 for a term of 5 years. This is an extension of a agreement we've had in place for a number of years, providing fire suppression services to the campground area only on the other side of the Condensatory Bridge. We met with KFN representatives, and the really only 2 items that we changed was the change the map. They've increased the size of the campground, so we wanted to make sure that we had a clear boundary of the area that we're providing the protection to, and then also adjusted the cost recovery provisions of the agreement and updated them to the current rates that are currently found in the interagency agreement. And with that, I'll open the floor to the questions.
Thank you. Through the mayor, I just wanted to add to Chief McDonald's comments. This is a specific example of an ongoing relationship that we've had for many, many years with Comox First Nation. It's I would say, an example of reconciliation. It is also an efficiency and practical response. We have an extremely well trained service that we can provide, and the nation itself can rely on that in partnership. And just want to acknowledge the hard work that happens between the 2 organizations on this. But it really is the type of shared service relationship that we are really trying to promote in the Valley, and we have great partnerships, particularly in the fire service area in this regard.
All right. And Councillor Moore.
Great, thank you, Mayor. Yeah, I was actually living at the campground for a few months, right around the time of the terrible fire with the trailer that exploded basically just a day or two before I moved in there. So it's good to know that this is yeah, that this agreement's in place or going to be in place or renewed. I had emailed Lisa today because I had a query about the name of the IR2, and I wasn't familiar with Pentledge. Probably other people on council who've been around for a while are, and I'm assuming that that's the legal, you know, the legal name. But I was just curious if our CAO or anyone had any idea around that name and whether when we look at I guess just the inconsistency with names and whether we're going to be looking at or if there's conversations around with treaty or anything like that around names. Yeah, I just found it interesting that it was a different name than I was familiar with.
Thank you.
Wondered if there was any clarification
Thank
on
you through
that.
the mayor to Councillor Morton. We're using the name that the colonial federal government utilizes to
Mhm.
describe that reserve. I would assume post treaty, then there would be a significant naming exercise or
Mhm.
that's just a presumption on my part. And we'd work with whatever we have. We unfortunately have constraints, Indian Reserve. These are all words that we must
Mhm.
use. We acknowledge that they are colonial and not modern terminology, but we're bound by that.
Mhm. It just made me think about that might be something in future that gets looked at. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Moore and Councillor Frisch.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. Just out of curiosity, where's the protection for IR1 come from?
Through the mayor to Councillor Frisch, IR1 has a contract with Comox Fire Rescue. That obviously is a much bigger area. It pretty much goes from Comox Road and up through a back road on both sides of that. They've had that contract for as long as I can remember and provide excellent service to that area there.
Yeah, and would there be some sort of agreement for us to help out if that was necessary?
Correct, that would be through our current mutual aid agreement.
Right.
If there's, I believe there's some KFN lands up in the Oyster River area, same thing. If they had a fire there that Oyster River required some assistance, we would be able to go up there under the mutual aid.
Thanks for your work on this.
All right, I don't see any further questions. If somebody would like to move the recommendation. Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Any further questions or comments? Seeing none, all those in favor? And motion carries. And we'll move into operational services. We have the water and sewer rate review, and I'll pass it over to staff. We'll just do. All right. It's best I can do for intermission music. Oh. Okay. I was just being notified that this may take about an hour or so if we wanted to take a comfort break or a dinner break prior to. Yeah, so dinner has arrived, so it's either going to be cold in an hour or not. So yeah, I think to break, and then that way also the speaker gets a chance to refuel as well. So maybe what we'll do is we'll look for a quicker break and try to be back at 6 p.m. That gives us 18 minutes. Oh, Councillor Warren.
Yeah, I just wondered, we do have someone in the gallery today. I don't know if they're waiting for a particular item, but I just didn't know if there would be an opportunity to vary the agenda if, no? Okay. All right. Just didn't want them to have to wait too long. Thanks.
All right. Okay. We're going to do our best to be back by 6 p.m. Acknowledging we are sometimes on island time. All right, thanks everybody for waiting, and we will move on to our water and sewer rate review. It's going to be presented by Kyle Shaw. So over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through the CAO to the Mayor and Council, good evening. I'm pleased to present the outcome of the water and sewer rate review. This evening's presentation will cover the water and sewer rate review findings, recommendations, and updates to previous analysis work. However, before we get started, I just wanted to acknowledge the hard work and dedication of our staff and our consulting team in the preparation of this information. It's a culmination of a few years of work and a couple of reanalysis along the way to ensure that we're embarking on the right path and making the appropriate recommendations based on where we've been and where we'd like to go, or where staff recommend that council consider we go with respect to rates, both for user fees and frontage taxes. So with that, I'm just going to do a brief presentation to walk us through some of the history and get into the results. So slide. Not sure if I have the clicker, if that works. There we go. Perfect. I can control my own destiny. So the outline for the presentation this evening is as follows. I'll provide a brief introduction into the review work, highlight some of the key goals of the review itself and associated findings, provide a brief background into how we got to where we got today, because there's a bit of history that goes along with this process, and why the update report. So why the 2023 and then the post 2024 update information, followed by the outcomes of the 2024 update, an overview of the 2025 to 2029 utility rate and frontage tax recommendations. And finally, as always, after the presentation, I'll open up the floor to council for any questions that they may have as we go along. So an introduction, back in 2022, the city enlisted Intergroup Limited to review the city's water and sewer rate, user rates and frontage taxes. They did so using or following the American Waterworks Association framework. The provided analysis was guided by the goal of establishing utility rates and frontage taxes at appropriate and equitable levels based on customer class. All of this with the aim of developing funding structures that effectively define revenue requirements relative to all associated components of each utility and those required to sustainably or self-fund the utility, as well as accurately forecasting for future needs that may be required to both support the ongoing day-to-day operations as well as capital renewal needs for our future. Some of the more detailed or specific goals of the analysis included determining utility rate revenue requirements for the CBRD charges and city operational charges, any debt servicing, current year capital, costs that weren't funded by reserve or debt, establishing utility rates at equitable levels based on customer classes, and determining frontage tax requirements to meet the reserve contributions for asset renewal, machinery and equipment, and future capital needs. So a bit of background into the analysis work. In 2023, Intergroup completed the revenue requirements and rate analysis for the water and sewer utilities. That analysis included determining revenue requirements for capital reserve and operating costs at a cost for service analysis by customer group to ensure equitability and a resilient rate design. This cost of service analysis identified that customer classes in some cases were both overfunding and underfunding service areas. Frontage taxes were funding operational shortfalls, and reserve contributions were well below the recommended levels as identified in the Sustainable Infrastructure Investment Plan, or as we know it, SIP. Data provided for the analysis included information from the water and sewers master plans, the Sustainable Infrastructure Investment Plan, the Water Smart Action Plan, the 2024 to 2028 5-year operating and capital budgets, revenue balances, water and sewer account details, water meter consumption detail, relevant bylaws, and CBRD bulk consumption and sewer conveyance totals, including future year bulk water price projections and treatment cost escalations. As a result of these findings, a complex and detailed review into the findings was undertaken by staff to further understand the depth of these results and to qualify or quantify the depth of corrective measures that may be required to establish sound recommendations. Recommendations that would meet the overall objectives of the review, thus creating defendable and sustainable results and rate recommendations for the future. The American Water Works Association Framework, or M1 principles for water rates, fees, and charges are summarized as revenue to cost coverage ratios, or RCCs. And I'll speak to RCCs throughout the remainder of the presentation, and I'll use the acronym. RCCs aim to illustrate if a particular customer class is contributing properly to the cost of services being provided. An RCC rate over 100% indicates that a customer class is paying at a cost of providing said service, paying more than the cost is to provide said service, whereas an RCC rate that's under 100% indicates that a customer is paying less than the cost of service being provided. If a particular customer class falls within the RCC range of 90 to 100%, they're considered to be within what's desired or called the range of reasonableness, whereas it's deemed that the class is adequately and relatively equitably funding the cost of a service delivery, and that rate adjustments are not necessarily required. They can be if the objective is to maintain 100%, but there's a tone of error on either one of the sides there. And so 90 to 110. So we'll use that as kind of a framework for the discussion as we continue. This methodology of analysis provided the basis for determining the utility rate rebalancing required to equitably distribute servicing costs amongst the customer classes proportionally and based on actual or forecasted usage. The RCC ratio that will be presented today are based on revenue required, forecasted, and overall corrections by 2029. So RCC ratios for water. So we ask the question, why are these ratios important to the overall rate review? The answer that I'll provide is that these ratios not only present the proportional value of the revenue collected by each customer class, but they also represent the total revenue that's required to fund the entirety of the utility as a whole when revenue is combined to deliver the overall service. They also provide a valuable insight into our understanding of the level or degree of equitability within the rates, being relative to actual usage for service based on demands on customer class and how they use that water. So the current numbers for water by customer class are as follows. Based on RCC and our analysis, residential currently sit at 86%, which is below the recommended. Multi-residential unmetered at 70%, multi-residential metered at 166%, so well above. Commercial unmetered 104, right in the sweet spot in the middle between 90 and 110. The commercial metered at 134, and ourselves inclusive of this review. So we looked at not only our commercial classes, our residential classes, but the city as a whole. Park services water usage is well below what we should be contributing to the utility. It's at 33%. And then fire protection services for fire hydrant maintenance is at 78%. So again, it's below in terms of providing the value for the service that's provided. So as you can see here, residential, multi-residential, parks, fire services all are underfunding the utility, while multi-residential, commercial metered are both overfunding the utility. So the RCC ratio for sewer, the current numbers for sewer by customer class are as follows. Residential is 109. Again, right in that sweet spot in the middle. Commercial is well below at 59%. And institutional is a little high at 132%. So as you can see, the storyline for sewer differs from that of water. In water, commercial metered customers are overfunding, whereas in sewer, the same customer class is drastically underfunding the utility. These overfunding and underfunding place inequity within the rates as residential and industrial users have been funding the commercial user shortfalls amounts. For example, in the case of commercial sewer, the total revenue generated for commercial sewer in 2003 was $772,000 as a whole, whereas the water revenue for that same class was $1.974 million. This represents only 39% of the recommended based on the proportional value, being of a portional of 74%. This represents a shortfall amount of nearly $720,000 in the commercial class. However, what we learned in the previous slide is that the commercial metered group is overfunding the water utility by approximately 34%. Here's the complexity of the review. we have to take into consideration all things that we're collecting in terms of information. So the actual shortfall for sewer operating is closer to somewhere in the middle of that 772, maybe even on the lower side, around 300,000. But it's an important point to make as we do this revenue review relative to cost of service, relative to customer group. We have to ensure that we're looking on both sides of the scale to ensure that the equitability of delivery of the services are fair and reasonable within the cost of service analysis for all classes. So I think it speaks to the complexity and the further importance of the need for the RCC corrections as we move forward. And that's where you'll see the change in the rates recommendations as we move. I gotta follow along here too. So utility funding requirements are comprised of both utility rates and frontage taxes. Contained within the utility rate structure is the total funding allotment for the CVRD. These regional charges include treatment, transmission, conveyance, capital replacement, and upgrades of the regional systems in support of the municipal utility, but it also supports regional growth requirements. Proportionally, this fund allotment represents nearly 50% in water and 42% in sewer of the total utility costs. There's a pie chart here on the slide that shows the water. The next one will show the sewer. It just represents the total amount that is requisitioned on behalf of the city for the utility, being 49% going to the CVRD, and the remaining amount used to function both our operations and our capital on the city side. So moreover, the aim of the utility funding structure is to effectively determine revenue requirements relative to all associated components that may be required to sustainably fund the utility, while accurately forecasting future needs required to support the ongoing operations of a utility. So on top of the CVRD funding requirements, each utility rate provides funding for the city's operating costs, being both indirect and direct. When I say indirect, I mean costs that aren't necessarily associated to the day-to-day operations or the intimacy of the workings that are happening in the field. And those are the more soft charge costs, finance, engineering services, those type of things that both work for the utility and have a degree of associated costs relative to the utility. So those are the indirect. Included in that is the machinery costs and equipment reserve contribution amounts. Those are funded through user fees, as those equipments and services are directly related to the use of that utility. And then frontage tax provide funding for adequate contributions to reserve for asset renewal and including debt servicing and potentially future capital needs. We could talk about the difference between using frontage tax for renewal and for growth, potentially for debt servicing, which again would still, the servicing amount would still be based on the frontage tax. However, be borrowing for growth and the reserve contributions based on SIP, solely isolated for renewal of in-service assets. I think the point that I'm trying to make there, moreover, is really about defining what frontage tax and user fees are actually used for as we go forward. So, with all that said, here are the forecasted 2025 to 2029 water utility rates and frontage tax. In recap, the analysis was guided by the goal of establishing utility rates and frontage taxes at appropriate and equitable levels that would fully fund the operational costs and capital costs of each utility today and into the future. For the sake of discussion and the ease of digestion, staff are presenting the results in the form of the impact on an average household. So in 2024, the average household financial contribution to the water utility was $694.14, which proportionally funded 49% of the CVRD's bulk water charges, 32% to administration and operations, and 19% for reserve contributions and water infrastructure renewal projects. The cost of service analysis, RCC results under the current rate structure distributed by customer class for water is summarized in slide 6, with a recommended 5-year utility rate increase would effectively establish a rebalancing of rates through RCC at 100% for each customer class in water by 2029. So that would bring the proportional value for water consumed for all customer classes across the board back into scale starting from day 1, 2029 as 100%. So there'd be no more outliers is what we're proposing, and this is what this presents. So an average household, the 5-year utility rebalancing plan, the utility rate increase over the 5 years would be $289.82 over the 5-year period. Of this, a total increase for the CVRD charge is $194.05, and the total increase for the city's administration and operating being $95.77. On top of that, to meet the funding level requirements for the SIP and the Asset Management Reserve contributions, the frontage tax rate is proposed to increase by $7.65 per linear meter over the 5 years, which has an impact on the average household of $167.01 for the frontage tax. The forecasted 2025 to 2029 sewer utility rate frontage tax are as follows. The 2024 average household financial contribution for the sewer utility was $618.01, which proportionally funded 42% for the CVRD, 29% for the city's administration and operating, and 29% for the reserve contributions for sewer infrastructure renewal projects. Under the same lens, the cost of service analysis RCC results under the current rate distribution by customer class for sewer as summarized in slide 7, with the recommended 5-year utility rate increases would effectively establish a rebalancing rate again of an RCC ratio of 100% for the residential customer class by 2029. The average household under the 5-year utility rebalancing plan, the utility rate increase would be $233.17. Of this, a total increase to the CVRD charges of $121 flat, and a total increase to the city's administration being $112.17. In addition to that, there's a recommendation for commercial class to have an increase in 2025 on average of $189 for the base rate, which is utility customer class rate 1 which is established at $438.64. And an increase of $201.77 for the base rate, the secondary base rate, which is utility rate 2. Oh, I'm still on the same slide. Thank you, though. The commercial customer class, and an increase of $201.77 for the base rate of $877.25. So I break that down and I speak to it a little bit further in the presentation. I know I'm listing off a lot of numbers here, but I just wanted to articulate the base rate change based on what the financial projections are required in order to bring it back to 100% RCC ratio. So to meet the funding level requirements for the SIP, for the Asset Management Reserve, the frontage tax would be increased by $1.69 per meter over the 5-year period, with an impact to the average household of only $28.39. So as a roll up, the 2025 to 2029 utility rates and frontage taxes for both water and sewer as presented would have an impact on the average household as in the following ways. For water, the total is $457.83, broken down by $194.05 for the CVRD, $95.70 for the utility operations, and $167.01 for the frontage tax. And for sewer, the total is $261 over the 5-year period. Broken down to the CVRD is $221, utility operations at $112, frontage tax at $28. The combined over the 5-year total increase is $718.39, which on average is $143 per year over the 5-year period. And that brings us all back to an even baseline of 100% RCC for all classes. So some of the recommendations. So staff recommend that council endorse the 5-year rebalancing plan and increase the water and sewer utility rates, thereby effectively closing the operational reserve shortfalls. Adjust the utility rates by customer class as per the revenue cost charge ratio to establish equitable rates relative to service demand. Increase the internal allocation funding for both parks and fire protection to match the actual funding requirements for those service areas. Complete a one-time increase for commercial class sewer utility rates at 23% in 2025, with a future vision for volumetric in 2026 and beyond, and I'll speak to that later. And increase the frontage tax to accurately and appropriately fund the water and sewer asset management reserves as per the recommended amounts as leveraged within the city's adopted sustainable infrastructure and investment plan. So future analysis recommendations, I want to speak to this simply because I think what's presented to here needs to continue to be modernized as we go. It's not just a one-time shot. To say that it's corrected today and ignored and hope that it retains would be something that we've considered a little bit naive of ourselves. We want to ensure that the utility rate reviews is a continuous process and that the RCC rates are remaining, and that the revenue requirements established to operate our utility as it grows and evolves remain intact. Some of the future analysis, though, particular recommendations is undertake analysis for volumetric pricing for sewer utility rates, and this would include industrial, commercial, and institutional portion properties only, so the ICC rates. I think we're at about 78% of all ICI customers are metered, so the volumetric rate would be based on the metered consumption on a proportional value. And the recommendation would be in the range of 70 to 80%, and it would be determined and brought back for council's consideration in the future. And that would provide the equitability on the sewer side based on the consumption demands by customer class within those particular groups. Determine budget requirements to fund the completion of the water metering program in the ICI and the multifamily properties. So between ICI and multifamily, we're not at 100% metered yet. We need to understand what the financial implications from a capital acquisition in order to achieve that, to ensure the equitability of the service is sustained. And determine frontage tax corrections for ICI and multifamily properties based on unit counts and not necessarily the linear frontage that is representative today. So the frontage tax for a multifamily complex, if it was a high rise, it's based on the linear frontage and not the total units. And so there's a disproportion of the amount that they actually consume or use relative to the capital that they would assume or consume as part of their structure or their building envelope. And then determine capital investment costs to create a residential universal metering program. And that's working in parallel with the Water Smart Action Plan. And those works are currently underway to understand what the capital costs are for the implementation of a universal metering program for the residential part. So thank you for your time. I know I threw a ton of numbers at you, and I'm probably going to get a ton of questions about those numbers, and I appreciate every question that comes forward. But with that, I'm happy to take any questions that council may have.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Really appreciate all the data and information. I know this has been something that I think has been talked about since I've been on council. So I know it's been a lot of work to get to where we are. So I really appreciate the effort that's gone in. Councillor Frisch.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. Thanks for the presentation, Kyle. It sounds like, as you outlined, that we're moving the fire services and parks recs usage from what I assume was paid for the fees from other users to basically general taxation. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And how big of a number is that in general?
Yeah, it's
Like
a great,
roughly.
yeah, it's a fair question. With respect to fire services, the number is not terribly difficult. We started minor adjustments over the last 2 years. The total service rendered for fire services is right around 300,000. So that is corrected over the 5-year period. I think today we sit at about 200. So there's about $100,000 shortfall within that service charge. I'll offer as well, before I get into the number for water consumption for park services, it's a one-to-one relationship. So the funding relative to parks water or fire service is happening in the utility currently because it's going in as water that's being consumed that's not qualified to a user group. So all of the user groups are qualifying and paying for that attributed value. So it represents as a reduction in the amount of revenue that's required on the utility side as it increases in general taxation. So it's a one-to-one relationship. As one drops, the other rises, and they're equal in terms of the representation.
Yeah.
On the water side, it's a bit more challenging. The current funding model for water consumption is fairly low. It's in around $150,000 to $160,000 per annum. And our actual usage in it for consumption relative to dollar figure is closer to $650,000 per year.
Okay, thanks for that. And is there any money being put aside for general or for water metering? Like saving up for the day when we go, yeah, we're gonna have to get everyone on board. Is there like a little pot of money? I can't remember if we've got started putting something aside or.
It's a great question. There's a few reserves under the water portfolio. There's nothing specific that I'm aware of for universal metering. But that's part of the analysis that's currently underway with Water Street Engineering, who prepared the Water Smart Action Plan. They're qualifying what those amounts and what those reserve contribution would look like today. They would be recommended in terms of additions of what the SIP already currently is projected for frontage, so that those collected amounts would be able to fund a potential universal metering program in the future.
Good to know. Well, this all makes lots of sense to me. Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor Fish and Councillor McCall.
Yeah, thanks. I have several random questions, so I'll ask on water and then I'll get back in the queue. I don't think they require a ton of detail, but so looking at the water, there's some multifamily classification that's unmetered. And the unmetered multifamily was identified as not, not being within that RCC ratio target amount. Why would they not be metered? They almost look like an anomaly. It was a pretty small number of actual units. So why would the approach not be just to get meters in those places?
That's a great question. They're typically the historic ones that weren't a requirement through subdivision application or development application. Today, that's a requirement and has been for several years that those properties are metered. So they're inherited through this process. The flat answer is it's very costly to meter multifamily sites. They have a fairly large service. They typically require a 2-inch and larger, and those meter chamber vaults are fairly significant in terms of cost of upwards of $50,000 per vault. So the cost balance in terms of putting it in and then the recoup for that is quite extensive.
So these would be older developments then, it
Correct.
sounds like. Okay, yeah, thanks for that. And I also noticed that there are still some commercial that's unmetered too, as that falls into the same classification, it sounds like.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, those are some of our older ones, including areas within the downtown core, some smaller. I'll offer that as we continue to do operationally every year, as we renew old meters to ensure the accuracy of those meters and the equitability of distribution of charges relative to those customer classes, we install new meters on a per annual basis, and that's a part of our ongoing operational program. And we've done that recommendation of analysis of install based on consumption or known consumption for those particular areas. So the ones that are still outliers and remain on the low end in terms of this are typically ones that we believe just based on the business type that they are low users. And so the flat rate is still reasonable relative to the consumption that they're portraying.
Right, that we're not missing some water consumption that's not being metered. So my other question, and this one is maybe requires a bit more detail, but frontage taxes you highlighted in further analysis and next steps that we need to revisit how those are calculated for multifamily. But I'm not clear how we do it currently. And yeah, I do recall from the last census that more than 50% of residential is at least more than a single family home now. So could you just flesh out like what the difference, well, how we calculate it for a single family lot and then the various applications?
Yeah, fair enough. Great question. Thank you for that. And feel free if anyone knows different than I. My understanding of it today, currently as it is, both residential and ICI based, it's based on a linear metered of the frontage of each property. So if it's a multifamily site and it's a 5-story building, it's just the linear frontage of that property that meets the public portion.
Okay, I was worried that that is in fact how we do it, which I mean, this is given what we're funding with the frontage tax, that calculation makes absolutely no sense. So I guess my comment, understanding that, is that I would think that coming up with a more rational method of calculating the frontage tax should be just as high as priority as implementing the changes to the frontage taxes in terms of these percentages for single family, because we're really not capturing what the capital costs are in terms of this density that we're I mean, on the other side of it, it's clear that the metering, where, you know, they may be paying a little bit more than what their fair share is. So I'm not saying that the whole system is totally inequitable, but given that we're trying to readjust how we do frontage taxes and have it represent our capital costs, like I would put an asterisk beside that and say that I think that's pretty important that we get that figured out in a way that makes more sense for what the capital burden is. And I'll surrender the mic for the next questions. I'm not done.
Fair. If I may, staff would concur with that conclusion, right? It's top of the list, that with volumetric for ICI. There's some significant underfundings that are occurring within the utility. Our job thus far has been to identify those opportunities for correction. The recommendations that are before you today aren't corrections for all of them, but as I stated at the beginning of the presentation, it's about starting somewhere and it's about understanding where our weaknesses are and where our opportunities are for the future, and agreed.
Thanks, Councillor McCollum, and thanks for the warning. Councillor Jolicoeur.
Yeah, thanks. I as well have a few questions, and thanks for this report. And just to piggyback on that last comment, I think one of my reservations around the recommendations that's in front of us tonight is as a result of, I appreciate we do need to get started somewhere, but that assessment around the volumetric for sewer, to me is a key data point in informing at least my decision around how to support the sewer component of this recommendation. And I guess a question of clarification as it pertains to that, and it's located a few times in the staff report, but not in the consultant report. It's just nomenclature. Like ICI is not, we don't see industrial as a class in any of the assessments, whether by the consultant or by staff. But then we're talking about doing further assessment. So do we include industrial in commercial? Is that an institutional?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a fair question. I use ICI as a broad term. It's a general term that we use in terms of utilities to identify particular customer classes. Industrial class, I'm not sure that any exist currently today in the city of Accordion. So that's why it's not specifically recognized as a class within. So I broadly speak to ICI as a general because it's the term we use. There is no industrial class within the city of Accordion.
Okay. The second question that I had was as it relates to the 110 recommendation for the RCC for the institutional. And I'll admit, I haven't gone and looked at the American best practice guide that you used in your assessment to understand how that best practice is considered within the Canadian or British Columbia or Comox Valley context. And I guess my concern is when I think about which portfolios, which property owners are within that class, the institutional class, they're likely facilities that have quite a lot of use of our sewer system. And without that volumetric assessment of our sewer system, I find it hard to understand if that's in fact, and I appreciate that in the staff report and you spoke about it in your presentation, we're aiming to move towards an equitable distribution of the costs related to both these utilities. And so I have a hard time in understanding that the 110 within the Canadian context, being these are publicly funded facilities primarily, that's the right number. So I'll leave it at that. Any
Yeah,
thoughts?
sure. It's a fair question. Thank you for that, Councillor Jolicoeur. American Waterworks Association standards are broadly accepted North American wide. They're adopted, they set the baseline for the utilities and for the utility infrastructure, and we follow that framework quite broadly within our process of both our engineering standards as well as our operating standards. In terms of specifically, when we talk about 110% for that particular class, the wastewater that's typically generated for those classes are often higher in terms of treatment costs. The hospitals inclusive within that class. So the waste that they typically generate, and given that we don't have a source control bylaw that would qualify and quantify that waste and the parameters of that waste, which would bracket them, generally speaking, into a criteria of cost, this is a way to, in a mechanism to do that without that data, without that knowledge. So the biohazards and the suspended solids and the makeup of that wastewater is typically harder to treat, requires more treatment costs rather than residential or generic commercial class.
Hang on.
So I should say that I guess, my question, I was, alluding to perhaps an interest in having that percentage be higher, not less. So I appreciate that you just, I feel, validated my concerns around, what those, portfolios are putting into our sewer system, but I'll cede the floor to others and I'll get back in line.
If I may respond to that as well. I hear you on that, and oftentimes communities and councils will recommend through these types of analysis that particular classes sit in a different RCC ratio. So to your point, Councillor Drillicourt, in commercial class may be recommended at the 110 or 120, depending on how you want to fund or generate revenue relative to the treatment costs that are associated with those particular classes of business, and that includes commercial and industrial. So it could be on the scale. It effectively creates, to a degree, if I may, a mill rate relative to your utility charges. But the volumetric piece will be another mechanism, and I think a more defined mechanism that's more important to speak to and to seek opportunity in terms of enhancement and inclusion within our service. It's not to say that that rate or that blocks rate system couldn't be introduced down the road, sorry. But again, great point. Thank you for that.
All right, and Councillor McCollum.
Thanks, Mayor. Yeah, so moving on to my sewer questions. So when we are looking at the RCC rate and how, that's costs are being allocated from the three classes in the table, but we're using kind of an arbitrary system of assigning charges, like we're got a few classifications for commercial business, but it's not necessarily related to how much water is being used, except maybe with the car wash and the laundromat, I think was two of them. So are we looking at the cost of delivering water and getting some kind of, that I'm just going to make up a number, that the water utility, 30% of those costs are commercial related. So we would want to see a similar proportion on the sewer side. Is that how we're figuring these numbers out without really having any real measurement of what's going into the sewer system? Is that?
It's a great question. Complicated answer. So yes, based on flat rate today, it's a proportional value of the assumed consumption. We only have flat rate currently for sewer. We have volumetric for water if you're metered, but the volumetric amount doesn't have a ratio of what you speak to offset that proportional flat rate. And so that's what we're recommending that we move towards, because right now the flat rate is the flat rate, regardless of how much water is consumed within that particular class. The volumetric would then allow us to create the equitability within that to ensure that the cost recovery is equal to, on a proportional value, roughly on an 70 to 80% of the water that's consumed within that particular class.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, so, I mean, we can look at rebalancing these costs, but if we continue to charge at a flat rate, we're kind of assigning costs in a fairly arbitrary way.
It's a fair statement.
Okay. So I'm in favor of looking at another method of calculating that as well. And I would assume my question around the frontage taxes for sewer or for water, it's the same answer around sewer. Like we have that same challenge that we're simply applying a linear foot regardless of the demands on our pipes in the ground.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the one thing that I might point out, the difference between the water utility and the sewer utility is that the frontage tax levy that exists relative to sewer is a relatively good number. The number doesn't need to increase all that much. As you can see, what we're recommending is that the user rate be increased quite substantially, because right now, as a funding as a whole, the shortfalls in operator are being funded by the frontage tax revenue. And so we need to increase that so that the frontage tax then can be used proportionally for those services and those capital.
And apologies if this question was already in the report, because it got pretty detailed in the tables, like in addition to the staff report. But for residential sewer billing, are we billing that as a straight utility, one house, one charge, or how are we calculating? Because it's not volumetric. You know, if you have a secondary suite, is there, you know, waste pickup, pretty straightforward right now. You're basically paying according to what kind of containers you're putting out on the street. Is everyone paying the same for sewer in single family homes, or is there various ways that we charge for that?
I'm giving you a moment to see if maybe our director of finance has the answer to that one as he scrolls through his screen.
Mr. Legemeyer.
I was buying you time, sir.
Wonderful. Nice to be here once again. We base it on the number of dwelling units. So if you do have a secondary suite, you get additional charges for sewer. If you have an illegal secondary suite, you don't. And so the system's not perfect yet.
And hence the illegal part.
If I may, though, if I may add to that, as we've unrolled, pun intended, the solid waste utility and we put the bins out, we're finding many of those that we didn't actually have on our records looking for an additional bin to support the secondary suite come to us. And so we've had the opportunity then to correct all utility accounts.
Right.
Unintended
And
consequences.
yeah, an upside to that service change. My final question, getting back to kind of the options in front of us and implementation, and generally reading it, I think the 5-year makes sense, although I do have some concerns about implementing it quickly when we have these other bigger challenges around frontage that we're, you know, going to apply these pretty substantial increases while not really having a great system that we're calculating it with. But I mean, we can work through that. But if we were to choose one for a quicker implementation, it looked to me like sewer would make more sense. If we wanted to do a longer implementation, water could be 8 years, or would you say the urgency is, you know, that lack of proper capital funding? Is it greater on water or sewer, or are they about the same?
It's a great question. It's a fair question. The bluntness of it is we prefer to have both.
Yeah.
If you're to push me into a corner, the sewer utility is drastically underfunded.
Okay.
And so the sewer utility definitely needs to be corrected.
That was my take as well. I just wanted to
I will offer, if
get
I
that
may, on
clear.
that point.
Sorry.
I will offer, I may, on that point. You know, nearly 50% of these costs of these increases are inherited by the city and the users as a result of the bulk water and treatment costs that we collect from this, or that the CBRD collects we collect on their behalf. Sorry. So over the 5-year period, only $403 is attributed to the city's cost, both for the water and sewer, and 315 is actually for the CBRD. There are opportunities for us to work with our residents and to work with council to understand what opportunities exist to reduce those costs. Water consumption is by an annual consumption volume. So if we are able to conserve water and reduce the amount of water that's actually consumed by our residents, those costs will continue to go down. We forecast costs a year ahead for water consumption. So we assume what 2025 is going to be in terms of last year's usage. We use kind of a historic calculator. It's a rolling calculator to give us a best guess and understanding of what those consumption demands will be. And we set forth a budget which establishes within our rates to ensure that we have enough money on hand through our billables that we'll have the money that we need to pay the CBRD when the time comes. And firstly, on sewer, we look retrospectively backwards to understand what our total consumption was last year, and those are our billables for next year. So whatever wastewater that goes through the pump station, through the metering, and into the wastewater treatment plant is what bases our rates for next year. They are proportional, though, to a degree. So there are opportunities through our I&I program to reduce inflow within our sanitary system. So increase renewals within our infrastructure to ensure that those are sound systems and we're not seeing peaking factors of wastewater on our wet seasons that are increasing our volumes, that are increasing our treatment costs. So those are good things to do. And on water, it's really about conservation. Our average day demand within the Comox Valley ranges in the wintertime, maybe between 12 and 20 megaliters a day. And in the summertime, it's upwards of 50 to 60 megaliters a day. So it just goes to show that in this winter time, when we've kind of cut back and there's not a lot of water that's being consumed within our irrigation systems, it's quite a bit in terms of what that means in the summer. And so those conservation measures could go a long way with respect to saving money as an overall utility and as a residential base.
Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor McCollum and Councillor Jolicoeur.
Thanks. If we look at the consultant report, I just want to rectify, I see in the table 7 under sewer use. This is page 6. And the staff report speaks to, and I appreciate that you highlighted it because it's the highest increase, the commercial users at 23% for 2025. But in the consultant report, it actually has 23% over the 5-year. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yep.
23% for our commercial. And so, yeah, I mean, that, you know, we hear pretty clearly from our business community that they're struggling right now. And so that is a little bit of a concern for me. And I understand that for some of those, they're underpaying. And so I think that for me, and I appreciate that the staff report is asking for us to approve the 5-year plan for both rates. But I think for myself that I was okay with the water, but I think I'm a little concerned with that large of an increase. And I think my other comment around this in general is that, and I appreciate that we're doing this work now and within the context that the general public sees really one bill at tax season, even though the utility is a separate thing. And we haven't yet decided on what that will look like for next year. And so seeing such a large number for the sewer rate for the commercial users is a little concerning for me. And I just wanted to add that comment. And I guess the context that I've seen around the rationale that's been provided both in the consultant report and in the staff report, as it relates to why 5 years over the 8 over the 10, whether it be for water or for sewer, is really just as it relates to the fact that that number will increase over time and will continue to be in deficit longer. And I guess my question to you, getting to my question is there a best practice around what is sustainable for a city of our size to be continuing to maintain a deficit as it relates to this? We've been doing it to date. I think the staff report says that we've been pulling from other places and using frontage to pay for operations and operations to pay for frontage, depending on which utility we're talking about. So I guess, you know, if we've been underfunding and overfunding in some areas to date, and I appreciate that we're trying to rebalance, is there another piece of information that would be helpful and other than the financial component in this decision or best practice that you can speak to?
I want to start with the commercial group or the ISAG group as a whole makes up almost 1/3 of our total consumption for water for the city. So that's almost $2 million of our total required revenue to fund the utility. And the utility on water side costs just over $6 million in user fees. And proportionally, they're only funding 34% representatively on the sewer side. So we're asking our residential customers to compensate for that on the sewer side. So there's a counter to both of those, right? And to go further into the point that you'd made about underfunding the utility and continue to underfund the utility to soften the rates increases that may be required to get us to a sustainable level, it is possible. And it's one of the options that are in here. The downside to that is that we'll be taking either from prior surplus, excuse me, or we'll be taking from the frontage tax revenue requirements that are to sustain our infrastructure renewals. And so our capital projects, instead of funding them with revenue from reserve, will be in a part having to borrow for those monies instead. And then we're effectively pushing those costs for renewal down the road. Whereas it's recommended that renewal is funded through taxation and that net new or growth is funded through borrow and debt servicing, because those net new will benefit those down the road.
And just as a quick add-on to that, and thanks for that context. And I will note too that in the recommended 5-year for water, that our commercial folks who are metered will see a decrease in their rate.
That's correct.
But those who are unmetered will see a large to then decreasing increase over the 5 years. So I just, I'm channeling our colleagues and our friends in the business community who might see the 23% and say that's a lot over 5 years. So so I think it might have to just be a communications piece around where we've come from, how we got here to this point. So,
Yeah, that's fair. It's a fair
Thanks.
point. The recommendation is in the workings from intergroup, they recommend 23 over the 5-year period. That will get them from the 59 back up into a 100% RCC. It will take the 5 years to do it, and they would see a 23% over each of those 5 years. What we're recommending is a one-time increase to allow us the time through 2025 to identify what volumetric rate would be so that there's equitability within the usage. So it's not taking what they presented us. Staff have taken that and said, okay, how can we do better? How can we make it more equitable for those customers? So recognizing just that, right? There are particular groups that flat rate may be a disadvantage to them, and that 23% may not be relative to the uses that they're having. But a volumetric would answer that, because then it's a pay for what you use based rate.
Excellent. Thanks, Councillor Jolicoeur. And yeah, I mean, we had this conversation around solid waste and residential basically subsidizing commercial. It didn't make the conversation any easier for the commercial folks who have now gone out to source their own solid waste removal. But again, I think that question around equitability and making sure people are paying the fair share, it's a tough one when things have been out of balance for so long. So it's definitely a difficult conversation. Councillor Moore.
Thanks, Mayor. Well, we know we're not able to do water meters yet, but one of the things that other communities have really benefited from is identifying leaks and the issue that causes. So just a quick anecdote, when I had a commercial building, the tenant had a leak in the toilet that created a huge cost to the water meter bill. And at that time, we weren't including that in the triple net, yada, yada. And then we ended up putting it into our lease agreement going forward. But that minor toilet leak was creating a huge amount of cost. So anybody who's not metered could have these leaks going on, and we have no way of really knowing. So I guess I'm just wondering what you see as the significance of something like that, and especially in these unmetered commercial spaces that are probably older, probably have more likelihood of these kind of leaks. I'm just wondering if you've got any thoughts on that and how that could be dealt with in any way, because it's costing. I mean, when you add it all up, it's costing a lot of money and it's wasting water and all those things. So yeah, just thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a great question. Water loss is a big topic. It's a big issue. Coming from my background in organizations where I spent 17 years in 100% metered utilities, leak loss, residential loss, billing monthly so that you knew what your consumption was monthly, those things start to draw out fairly quickly. And as you've articulated, if you don't have a meter and your annual metering, or you do have a meter and that meter billable is only coming once a year, you only find out about it at the time of that notice. And so we look at ourselves first. Obviously, as a utility, we understand what our leak loss ratio is as a utility as a whole. A healthy utility is in around 7 to 10% total losses. A very healthy utility is around 3%. We're in about the 15 to 17% loss mark. Now understanding that we're not necessarily charging ourselves appropriately for our own usage through parks, those numbers again will come down, which is great. So these are some of those key findings as we go through this process. But working with our residents and our business to ensure that they understand where their losses may be is a super important process. And we can do that as part of our conservation measure program, as our ambassador programs are out talking about not only sprinkling, but we do have little tablets that are dye tablets you can put in your toilet, and we distribute those as well so that people understand where those losses are. One leaky toilet, as you described, can be catastrophic in terms of the amount of water that it uses in any one household relative to not knowing where that water is going. And compounded over many, many households within a community can be quite a bit in terms of overall loss. So it's an important aspect. We also operationally, over the last 3 years, have instituted a leak detection program, which we run on our own systems. And we do that through our system with our UDF, our unidirectional flushing program. So where we're doing unidirectional flushing, afterwards we go back and do leak detection within those areas. So the city gets leak detected on a 5-year basis. The entire city, the entire utility, all of our pipes and services. And in that leak detection, we're able to identify if there's high consumption usage based on sound with any one service, because it does leak detection over a period of time, over days and overnights. And it takes the lowest sound baseline as a value. And if you get peaks in those, you can identify particular properties that have higher consumption off peak hours. And then we can have that one-to-one conversation with them. So we're making gains on this slowly as our systems improve and as our operators are out there working on our utility. But we continue to improve the way that we deliver our service in an effort to conserve as much water as possible.
I just think with the grumblings that we will have with the rates going up, always having that communication around, there is personal responsibility for the consumption and leaks are one part of that. And I mean, it's also, all the hose, all the water that's going down your drain when you wash your car or whatever. So, yeah, I just hope that we include that aspect, instead of us getting all the flack for the water costs going up. Thanks.
I maybe just have one small clarification, because again, this is something that was, I think, brought up to council quite a few years ago. I think on my first term, in terms of how there was this inequality, but it sounded like that between the frontage and the usage taxes or fees, that they basically were whole, that they were generate enough revenue. But I just want to clarify, right now, if we looked at water and sewer, are they generating enough through this, or are we actually subsidizing them through other means like general taxes? Does that make sense? Mr. Legemeyer.
Oh, I can answer that one. Nice to be here again. There are no funds that flow from general taxation into the water and sewer funds.
So they're whole as is, they're just out of balance.
They are whole. What I'd like to identify is in the sewer fund, in the 5-year capital plan, there's about $20 million of borrowing. And a lot of those projects aren't for new construction, it's for renewal. So what happens by underfunding utility? You got to replace pipes and bits. You get the money from other places. You borrow $1 million, it costs you $1 million over the 20 years. So it's, where do you put the burden on today's people or your kids?
Right. So not quite whole, but maybe the illusion of being whole. Okay, thanks so much. I don't see any further questions. If somebody would like to, Councillor Hilly. Oh, yeah.
Sorry,
you're first.
Yeah.
Did you have a question, Councillor Hilly?
I'll go.
Okay, we'll let Councillor Hilly go first.
Thanks, Mayor. So this is a lot of information, and I'm just wondering if there's any thought given to doing this by way of a lunch and learn, just given some of the intricacies of it and, the amount to digest.
Mr. Garvin.
Thank you through the mayor, and staff can correct me if I'm wrong. We have talked about this in a lunch and learn environment. It is a lot of information. Council could receive it and ask for some time to digest it and come back. that's completely within the realm of possibility. We are in the process of building the financial plan, and the utilities are a separate component, but incorporated into that long term. And so the reason why this is in front of you is because of the work that had happened in the past and our time there. But we would definitely respond to council's direction, and if you need more time, but please carry on if you have any other questions, and that we'll take council's direction on this matter.
Thanks, Mr. Corbett. And Councillor Jolicoeur.
Yeah, thanks. And yeah, that's kind of where my thinking was going in particular, just to build on Councillor McCollum's comments on the future analysis slide. I agree with her. I think there are two components, and I guess my question is the analysis on the volumetric pricing for sewer and the frontage correction. Is that work that can be done between now and the end of the fiscal, like between now and the budget season, or is that something that will take an extended period of time?
Yeah, sorry to answer that question. It would take time through 2025 to look at the details of that and come back with reasonable recommendations for what those numbers need to look like.
Okay. Yeah. I guess my only comment on that, it seems like we've done a fair bit of work on certain classes, and then in other classes we haven't, yet we're being asked to approve something for all the classes. And I think I go back to my earlier comment that I think I would appreciate having all this data in front of me when making decisions on the classes that we yet have the information, the institutional, commercial, industrial properties. So thanks.
If I may. Yeah, thank you for that. It's a great point. It's a great statement. I think my staff would probably articulate very similar comments to Kyle. You keep asking us questions and more questions and more questions, because the more we dig, the more we find, and the more we want to solve, and the more we need to understand. And it's about a balanced approach. I could have taken another year, already taken a lot of time to come to the table with what we have today to find all of the solutions and all of the answers. But the longer we wait to start to rebalance, the further we get away from what that rebalance might look like, and not being able to correct certain things that are easy to correct today become very complicated when you try to correct the more intricate, detailed pieces when you get into volumetric for ICI. If you're able to correct and rebalance the majority of the envelope, and that's what this aims to do, it's not perfect. It corrects 80% of the envelope, then that 20%, those micro corrections become much easier to analyze and much easier to understand what the implications they are on the revenue generation portion of what the utility service require. So to wait would be a disadvantage in terms of what staff would recommend, because we would be able to set and establish a new baseline to start our forward analysis. We continue along that pendulum of continue to analyze the impacts of further analysis without doing the corrections, and they continue to compound the complexities of those analyses.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I guess, I mean, kind of going back, and I apologize, I was looking at a table that I thought was going to be the next one, because the other two ones were in the water and sewer rate review PDF document that we had, which is that, I think it was table, what was that, table 6 on page 8. Of that one that talked about utility rate 1 or utility rate 2, car washes, laundries, hotels, et cetera, and that 23% increase. And I guess that's one of the questions I guess I'm still a little nervous about. I mean, we're saying 23% for 2025 with a bit of an unknown for 2026 through 2029, I'm understanding, or are we thinking it's probably 23 per year?
So the recommendation in terms of correction for flat rate would be 23% over the 5-year period to get them from the 59 to 100. That's what it would take, and that's what it would require. What we're suggesting is continue forward with a recommendation of 23% one time in 2025, and then embark on the analysis for volumetric to ensure that the equitability stance is there, so that we can make a recommendation as to what those charges should be based on the metered consumption for each of those commercials.
Okay, so 23% in 1 year gets us kind of whole without the volumetric side.
It doesn't.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's 23% compounding for 5 years would make us whole based on flat rate.
Right.
It's the 23% one time to buy us the time to do the analysis, to come back with what a volumetric comparable would be to each of the commercial classes. So it doesn't make us whole.
Right. So some might have a
It's-
higher, some might be lower.
It's still an underfunding of the utility as a whole.
Yeah. But if it's 23% that first year, the second year, it'll be an average of 23%. But if we've been analyzed it, some of those rate classes might be a little higher or lower.
Yes.
All right.
Very good. I like that.
Okay. I'm getting it clicking up here. So thanks for that, Councillor Frisch.
Yeah, thanks. I'm sensing, some would like more time to digest the info. It's also sounds like some are interested in, learning more about the ICI use. And, increasing it by 23% puts a little shop, the bathroom in the back that no one really uses, paying a lot more than say a restaurant, or is that kind of the idea for sewer? Because we don't really charge them significantly different numbers or on the frontage side. Or is
On
that not-
frontage tax is a whole based on the linear frontage, and the proportional value of increase that's required on frontage for sewer is actually very low. It's about $1.64. And that correction can happen over a 1 year period. You'll see in the tables that's presented, the correction for frontage is a one-time impact, and it's 0% for 2025, 6 and beyond.
My apologies. That's on the fees side then.
Yeah,
We're
it's on
talking
the
about
fees side.
about metering,
Yeah, the
right?
fee
Or-
side, so the lowest utility rate fee, so just a small business, currently is around $460. That increase would be between $90 and $100 based on flat rate for 23%, which is still well below the proportional value that they pay from a water perspective.
Well, in short, I'm happy to move forward with this. I'd like to see the changes made and then see what we can do next year on the rest of the sewer charges. And if you're willing, I will move the recommendation.
Okay, recommendation has been moved. Okay, Councillor Frisch moved it, Councillor Moran seconded it. Are there any questions and comments on the motion on the floor? We'll wait for it to come up on the screen. Actually, I can pass it over to Councillor McCollum.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I'm happy to support the recommendation as it's written. Yeah, the truth of the matter is that we're underfunding reserve in order to meet the needs of the utility. And so whether we're happy about these increases or not, these are the costs that we have in front of us. So I don't have an issue with supporting the recommendation, but I do want to flag that I think there's just as great a priority here in dealing with, I would say, I think the big challenge here is that we have kind of an outdated system in how we're calculating and distributing these costs back to the utility users. So I just want to emphasize that I think that's important work, and I'd like to see it incorporated into the work plan in the near future. But for the recommendation that we have in front of us, I'm supportive. Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor McCollum. Any further comments or questions? I'll call the question. All those in favor? And motion carries. Thanks so much, Mr. Shaw. A great presentation. Again, very complicated. I know we're trying to get things going here, so really appreciate it. Next, we've got the Animal Control Services and SPCA contract updates.
Thank you.
Mr. Garbutt.
Through the mayor to council, we have under item 5.1 update. It is a briefing note, but I'd like Kate O'Connell to give an overview, as this is a service change in the community.
Thanks very much. So as you all know, animal control is essential for the well-being of both our residents and the local animal population. We've always valued our partnership with the Village of Cumberland and with the SPCA. However, over the past year, we've recognized the need to modernize our approach to animal control. And last year, we conducted a review of our existing model, which was based on the contract with Cumberland. This review highlighted several key limitations, including service inconsistency due to the reliance on a single contractor, challenges with file management, and the inability to do proactive animal control enforcement. To address these issues, and after exploring alternative service delivery models, we decided to transition to an in-house model, which became effective in April of this year. We trained all of our bylaw officers in animal control, ensuring that we have a dedicated and well-trained team available. This has already led to improvements in the service areas that we are hoping to address. Moving on to a significant development that has required us to adapt our approach even further. In January, the SPCA informed us that it would be discontinuing their animal control services in the entire Comox Valley. This decision was unexpected and presents a significant challenge for our community. This means the SPCA will no longer be accepting strays, selling dog licenses, or holding dangerous dogs awaiting court dates. We are actively working to find alternative solutions to ensure that essential animal control services remain available. To address this, we immediately collaborated with other municipalities in the Comox Valley, including the town of Comox, the village of Cumberland, and the Comox Valley Regional District. We are pleased to report we've identified a suitable kennel that can provide animal control services, and we're currently in the processes of negotiating a new contract. While we appreciate the initial involvement of the Comox First Nation, they have decided not to participate in this kennel solution. We are confident that we will reach a mutually beneficial agreement with the kennel provider to ensure continued service. As you can imagine, the transition has a financial and an administrative implication. We've done our best to reallocate funds from the previous animal control contract to cover the cost of our in-house model and to contribute to the new kennel service. We're also working to find new sale options for the dog licenses, and we'll be presenting those recommendations in the future. We recognize the importance of continuity in animal control services and are committed to addressing this transition. We've been working very closely with the SPCA as well as the other affected municipalities to achieve this goal collectively. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks very much. And we have Councillor McCullough.
Yeah, this is quite the briefing note. Yeah, I mean, I guess when things are running well, we don't really consider what potential gaps could pop up. But yeah, this is a pretty big issue to solve. So I'm happy to hear that there are some options available. I had two questions. One, I'm not sure if it was left out, maybe because it's not public information, or maybe it's a factor in negotiating that new contract. But what was the previous contract? Like, what was the cost to the city previously with the SPCA?
So we had standard monthly contract costs, which were about $1,400 a month. But then there were fees related to specific services. So there were unique fees for the holding of dangerous dogs. Dogs or strays that we brought in under bylaw, the city would cover things like the medical expenses, because often those animals had not been well taken care of, and the SPCA would not receive them from us in that state. So $1,400 was a monthly fixed cost, but there were a lot of other variable expenses that have been adding up over time.
Yeah, that makes good sense. And then I had a subsequent, now I've forgotten what I was going to ask. Oh, I was interested to hear that it's a city responsibility to, keep an animal that's deemed potentially dangerous in advance of a court hearing. Because would that not, I mean, is that not a provincial, how is that city is responsible for a legal proceeding?
So it depends on the scenario. So typically the court proceedings, or at least the ones that I've been involved in over the last 4 years, is seeking a consent order. So the consent order is essentially an agreement between the city that's registered with the courts and the pet owner that identifies a series of different requirements. So this could include having signage on your property, designating that there's a dangerous dog on premise, making sure that the dog, when they're in the backyard, is appropriately secured with right fencing. We may require muzzling when in public, as well as several different notification requirements in the event the dog becomes at large or if they move to a different location. It can take time to go through that process, but until those requirements are put in place, the dog itself, based on the past behavior, because consent orders are typically only enacted when the dog has a history of that violent behavior, typically unprovoked. So we would seize the dog work with the legal team on the consent order. And then only after the consent order has been signed by the dog owner will the dog be returned under the conditions that protect the public from that dog.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So if we're initiating them, that would be when we're responsible. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Councillor McCollum and Councillor Cole Hamilton.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor, and thanks for this, Kate. It's good to hear that we're obviously in the home stretch of finding a solution. And I just wanted to get a bit of clarity on there's one statement about the December 2023 thorough assessment of the service. There's just saying that it conflicted with the city's fundamental values, which concerned me. And I'm assuming that the service we're looking at now is more aligned with our fundamental values, and just, I'm not sure how much you're able to say, but if you could help me understand what dimension that is, because animal, you know.
As my fellow director would say, great question. Thank you for asking it. We went through a lot of development and bylaw policies last year, including the bylaw compliance policy, which outlined the pillars that the city should be approaching bylaw enforcement with. In addition to that, we did a significant amount of engagement through public survey, and we really heard from residents what their expectations were in regard to the provision of service. So one of the items that are identified are the service deficiencies that under the previous model include the impact of reliance on a sole contractor. When that one individual who services both the city, the village of Cumberland and the city of Courtenay took a vacation, was ill or had an absence due to any other matter, that's when we had no animal control service at the time. So in the event of a dangerous dog that may have engaged in dangerous activities while that person was on vacation, we unfortunately would have no way to respond to it. In addition, the feedback we heard from the engagement process was that folks were really wanting to see proactive. So our officers getting out and about, being in parks, looking and talking to folks who have off-leash dogs or things like that. And honestly, with having a part-time bylaw officer under contract, they typically were just catching up on complaints that had come in the other days where they weren't working for the city of Courtenay. So we're unable to do, for the most part, any kind of proactive enforcement. So after hearing from the public what they expect from the bylaw division, and then looking at what some of our challenges were, we saw that as an opportunity to make some big changes. And now all of the bylaw officers can respond to animal control issues. We're able to more easily pass files from one officer to another to allow for continuity of service and no impacts due to vacancies.
Okay, thank you. And just the fundamental value of the city that was not being met or wasn't aligned with, that's just the consistent delivery of service. Is that the fundamental value you're?
That as well as the objectives outlined in the bylaw control policy.
Okay. All right, we'll leave it there then. Thanks. I'm glad you're close to a solution though. Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor Cole Hamilton and Councillor Moore.
Thanks, Mayor. I guess I'm curious what other communities do around this. Do most other communities contract with SPCA? Like, is this something that's happening all over? And I guess I'm curious because if, you know, if SPCA was the main contractor in many communities and now they're not going to be, I wonder about a new contract with a new provider that, you know, there's liability around dangerous dogs and aggressive, you know, I guess I'm just curious how that's managed in terms of, yeah, you know, contractors that maybe are new in the game. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Councillor Morin. The Comox Valley is unique. We are the only ones who are affected by this service change. The impact on the SPCA change of their contract is only the Comox Valley facility. No other facilities in the province are being impacted the same way. In regard to the kenneling service providers that we're looking at, these are, this is a service provider who has been providing kenneling services in the Comox Valley for some time. So they do have the professional background in order to undertake the required service areas. The SPCA will still be providing donor-related services to Courtenay residents, which include animal surrenders, you know, their list of appropriate dog trainers, things like that. So residents who maybe have kittens and can't take care of them are still able to provide those animals to the SPCA. It's really only the ones that we are seizing as a result of a bylaw infraction. And last year, it was not a significant number. I am confident in saying it was less than 30 overall, and most of the animals were picked up same day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Moran, and I don't see any further questions at this point. It is just a briefing note, so I'll just receive that unanimously for council, and we'll move on to bylaws for first, second, and third reading. And we have, well, I'll pass it over to Mr. Garbutt, maybe.
Thank you. Through the mayor to council. We have an update to a lot of the great work that was done in implementing the provincial legislation on the SHMU. Everyone's having fun saying SHMU around the province. I heard SHMU said a lot at UBCM, et cetera. Our Director of Development Services is going to give an overview of this fine tuning or minor amendments to the zoning bylaw in this regard.
Thanks. Ms. Wade.
Through the mayor to council, here before you today, as promised in June, when we were discussing SHMU and the 3 months to get this together, we felt that we would have some amendments that would have to come before council. Subsequent to our meeting in June, we have met with the development industry on 2 occasions with our consultants at Kistix to work through some of the design considerations. And through that discussion, we have brought forward some amendments for council's consideration tonight. And we've also identified some minor clerical housekeeping matters that we wanted to address as well. So, and the first, I just wanted to highlight some of the major pieces I think that might be of interest to council, just to explain what these amendments are and why we're doing them. So the first thing is I wanted to just talk quickly about the general regulations, which is Division 6. And in there, you might recall we had a discussion about the relationship between the ADU, the accessory dwelling units, in relation to the house size. And we had wording in there that restricted it so that that ADU must be lower than that principal building. We had some discussion about houses and their building forms, and that may not be applicable in some areas of the city. So we're coming back to amend that so that that general regulation just simply says that the ADU height is 6.5 meters, and that aligns with the R-SHMU zoning. So we have alignment on the 2 areas in the zoning bylaw, and we've addressed the concerns raised about the height of the principal building dictating in the general regulations the height of the ADU. So that's the first clarification. I also wanted to discuss in the R-SHMU zone that in one thing that we're asking for is amendments to within the parking. So currently in the R-SHMU zone, what we did is adopt and say just refer directly to Division 7 for the parking requirements. We, in discussions with the development industry, we've looked at some of those requirements and realized that it's not really conducive to the building form that we are trying to promote and support with infill housing, which aligns with our OCP. So we've looked at those driving aisles and parking, and what we've said is let's make this specific to the R-SHMU zone so that we can support and encourage the infill housing, which is also written in the OCP. A lot of the parking was done at a time when we were looking to larger units and larger like multifamily units. And so that zone, that building type is very different than a 4 units going into a small lot and lot ranges. So we've analyzed it from a building form and design and made recommendations specifically for the R-SHMU zone about the driving aisles so that it allows for the building form to provide on-site parking and also helps to support strata. Previously, we did have in our R1E specific wording in that R1E that dealt with a reduced drive aisle, and that was for strata developments only. So we're trying to move away from that and sort of look more comprehensively at the zone and support what we're trying to do from a building form and design. So that's why we're asking for that reduction in the driving aisle in the R-SHMU and specifically address that in the R-SHMU zone with the amendments before you tonight. I also wanted to talk a little bit about bicycle parking. Currently, in Division 7 for bicycle, Part 3 for bicycle parking, again, what's happening is that if you had 1 or 2 units, it doesn't apply. But if you have 3 or 4 units, it does. And the specifics and prescriptions within that are quite detailed and onerous. So what happens is it impacts the building form and reduces the ability to build residential versus what's happening with what's being asked in that prescription. So we're saying, let's just simply take those prescriptions out for this form of housing only to allow for class 1, which is the visitor parking will be removed, but the class 2 will be provided for the residents on a sliding scale based on unit size. And so we're proposing to do that as an amendment so that it helps promote housing and that those bicycle units will be secured as was the intent for class 2 in the specifics within the RSHMU zone. So these are about looking at the building form, what's in our zoning bylaw, and what do we do to be flexible and encourage infill housing and increase the housing supply. And we've identified that some of these things are just not conducive with this building form. And so that's what we're proposing tonight. And then we will be looking at this further as we move through our zoning bylaw updates, because we realize there's a number of concerns that we have raised on previous applications where we've looked at a reduction on how we apply bicycle parking because of the concerns with insurance and fire protection with EV storage. And so we have to look at some of those changing parameters that are coming about. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions. And of course, I have our manager of community and long-range sustainable planning here as well, Ms. Gothard. And so we're happy to answer any questions you may have.
Excellent. And maybe one thing just so I've got an example in my mind when you're talking about the ADU height is the idea that if you had a rancher that was not a tall building and then your ADU had to be shorter, is that kind of the idea where this kind of helps correct that, where you might have a very short building? Yes.
Yeah.
I don't want to be.
Yeah, through the mayor to council. Yeah. So what we had a discussion back in June too, that if you had a lower house, like say a bungalow type, but you had a garage in the back and you wanted to put an ADU in there, then that height restriction came into play because it was the principal building that was anchoring that height. That's been we talked a little bit, that's sort of been a long-standing practice in zoning, and we wanted to be more proactive and flexible. So we're just saying flat 6.5. And we had that built in the SHMU zone, but we didn't have it in the general regulations.
Right. Okay. Thanks so much for that. Councillor Jolicoeur.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. And thanks for the clarifications and for staff bringing this forward. I do recall that when we are considering this, you did warn us that, this is new and that we're going to learn from this and we'll probably be back in the next few months. And I appreciate that you've met twice with the development industry to hear about how some of the changes are impacting their work and building the housing we desperately need in the community. I guess I have 2 clarification questions. One, as it pertains to reducing bicycle parking, and you spoke to, just in the staff report, this is page 3 going into page 4. It's the last paragraph on page 4 in that section 11, speaks to the reduction in class 2, which is the residence bike parking, from 2 per unit to 1 per unit for studio and 1 bedroom. And you spoke about sliding scale. So the rest of that sliding scale is not in here. And I couldn't find it in a quick Google of our existing bylaws. So do we know what that is for 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms, 4 bedrooms? I'm assuming the sliding scale goes up, more bike parking depending on how many bedrooms per unit.
Yeah. Through the mayor to Councillor Jolicoeur, yes, it's 2. So anything that's over 1 bedroom would require 2 bicycle parking spots.
And that's the maximum.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, very small sliding scale. If I can, one more clarification question.
Absolutely.
Just because I didn't catch this the first 2 times I read it, but I'm reading it again right now. Number 12, the screening, the vegetation screening. The last paragraph, in light of the above, the draft amendment will remove vegetated buffer or screen fence from section 8.1.10. If you were to read that really quickly, I think you would assume that we're just removing that as a requirement, period. But in fact, I want to clarify my understanding. It is going to still be a requirement, just in another section in the development permit area section.
Through the mayor to Councilor Crowe, that'd be correct. We're proposing to use the development permits as a way to do screening because that's actually where it is. And so that's exactly how we would do it.
Yeah, well, thanks. I have a comment, but I don't see others with questions. I just want to say thank you. I mean, we've heard from the development community after this passed. I know that I've received correspondence directly, and council has as well. So just, you know, if this passes, are we going to be doing any communication to the public around this particular? I think it's really important because there was a lot of angst in the development community, as well as, you know, mom and pop folks who are just considering, oh, maybe I'll build a second unit on my single family dwelling property. So I think that this is just responsive governance, and that we did something, we also put it into practice, and we heard from folks, and now we're coming back, and I'm really proud of that process. And I just would be curious to know if that's something that we plan to communicate back out to the public.
Yeah, through the mayor to Councilor Jericho, thank you for asking that, because I was remiss in saying we received no comments, and we actually did a complete mail out to the development industry as well. So that people, there was notification, and also we directly contacted the development industry to tell them the updates were coming, and we received no comments, and we will continue to communicate this out to the community and have our regular meetings with the development industry.
Fantastic. Thanks, Councillor Zolliker, and Councillor Moore.
Oh, thanks, Mayor. Thought someone else had a light on. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that with such a substantial change through the province that we haven't received much feedback at all. I mean, I think I've had a couple emails about it. So I guess, yeah, I mean, it might be one of those things that, again, there's so many things going on that it's flying under the radar. And then once we start seeing it go into practice, then we'll start hearing about it. But you know, the screen and the buffer is one example of how we've, put in something that maybe will help mitigate some of those concerns with this increased density. Are there any other examples that that you can give that are kind of outside of the legislation that we've added, or yeah, anything that I guess mitigates some of those concerns, even though we maybe haven't heard them yet?
Through the mayor to Councilor Moore, thank you for that.
Proactive, I guess, is.
And I think that you've hit on something that staff is trying to do, is to be proactive. So we're also working with the industry, like as we meet and we hear more tools about how we can do that. We also have to be cognizant of the legislation saying, you know, not to be unreasonable in how we do things. So we are going to actually revise our development permit area guidelines. We have initiated those discussions at our last development industry, and we're working on that, and we're going to bring that forward to sort of deal specifically with this form and do it in a way that still is flexible and not in line with the regulations. So we are doing that. And I would say one of the things that we're working with the applicants we have to date is working through how you go about the tenure types with these properties, because there's a lot of work we have to do in regards to strata and stratification and how we go about doing it. So that's been a big education piece that we are working through with people who are applying and understanding. So we are spending time working with the applicants, walking them through and talking about it. And and explaining the strata process and what you can do, what you can't do. You know, if you want to do a fee simple party wall subdivision, how does that work? So there's lots of exchange that is going on, and generally speaking, people are really receptive to staff sitting down and spending that pre-application time. And anything we learned that we could do to, you know, deal with screening, etc., we'll definitely bring it forward in the revised development permit guidelines.
And I mean, I understand that we're tied by the legislation, and there's a good reason for it. And I think that, you know, some of these projects will be more palatable than others. You know, sometimes there's a concern that big developers are gonna come in and just, cram all this housing in there and it's gonna just be awful for the neighborhood. Other times it's, someone who wants to add some housing for multi-generational living and all these other things. The point is to increase density and increase housing. But I think, hopefully we will have some ways of, kind of managing those things that come up, that are within our control, which may not be much. Thanks.
Mr. Garbutt?
Thank you. I just wanted to reflect on the past 3.5 years of conversations the city has moved and embraced through our community plan as well. We regularized and recognized secondary suites well in advance of this. So Courtney has always been at the forefront of housing. More 50% of our housing stock is not single residential houses. So we have everything from soup to nuts all over community, especially in the lower half of the density. Many communities our size have single residential and then, varying apartment buildings. We've got garden apartments, we've got live work arrangements. Like we've been at the forefront since for over 50 years in Courtney. So I would suggest that this is an incremental process. And in order to actually do this, the more issues you raise at the beginning of the process will make it more difficult for these units to be developed. And if they're not developed, then we don't actually gain the knowledge on how to do it. So I really think this incremental approach, it's a characteristic of a number of our planners, is an incremental philosophy where we can react, monitor, go through, because a lot of the concerns that were raised related to secondary suites where we previously had to rezone for that, they were all really adequately addressed. So I really think that this incremental approach will help. And without ADUs going in or the SHMU starting, we won't really know. And so we are kind of embracing some of the work that Kelowna had done. For those of you here at UBCM, if you're a nerdy planner like me, I was driving around all these neighborhoods in Vancouver to see their Vancouver laneway homes and various things where, and some you might go, holy moly. And so I really think it's going to be really neat. And developers and builders and neighborhoods in Courtney have really, as I said, been at the forefront for well over 50 years in terms of accepting and adopting this. So we're really excited to see it do it. And I know that our development services staff are really working closely as much as we can. We have heard in some infill issues, there were issues raised with variances, et cetera. And so we're never going to get it 100% perfect, but really like this kind of reporting back, fine tuning type of process. And I would anticipate that probably over the next assuming that the legislation stays the same the way it is, that we will continue to fine tune this, especially some of those issues related to parking and views and all that kind of stuff. So I wanted to lend my support to our colleagues in development services that are at the front line on this, and as well as both the neighborhoods and the developers and builders that include just small scale property owners that are going to try this and really help. And that's the spirit of our affordable housing initiatives that are embraced in the community plan. So I want to say thank you for that.
Thanks, Mr. Garbutt. And Councillor Hilling.
Thanks, Mayor. I perhaps didn't fully hear the response to Councillor Jolicoeur's question because there's an air conditioner blowing in my ear back here. But the staff report does make reference to staff preparing for wider public engagement. And I just wondered if there's any specifics that are involved in that, like in terms of going out and hearing from the public. You make reference to a public hearing in the later section, not required in some cases, required in others. But what exactly are we doing to engage the public specifically?
Through the mayor to Councillor Hillian, yes, it's in relation to the development permit areas that we would go into wider discussion in regards to the changes that we'd be doing with the development permit areas, because the development permit areas have to be amended through the OCP. So we'd have to do an OCP amendment for those DPAs. And then we also have to amend the zoning bylaw because it's a two-pronged touch. So that's why we were saying in the report that as we move forward with the changes to the development permit areas, that would be the wider engagement. And then we also will be updating our webpage and talking about this. And as we move through, we've actually put together an information book with our consultants at Kistix that we will make available for the general public. So it's like a little brochure, and putting together those kind of communication pieces to make available for the wider public. And so that's kind of where that was alluding to.
Okay, that's helpful. Thanks. And the other question I had was the 286,000 that we got from the province. Has that been enough? And are we in fact staffed up in the Development Services Department now? Or are we still working around the clock and short of people?
Oh, no, you have to ask my husband.
I think that answers the question.
No, we're actually doing pretty good. We are just, we still are short, 2 positions, but we have, our new manager has, joined us, Jamae Shealy, who's, our manager of development plan. I think some of you met her the other day. And so she's, going into week, 4. And, so very much helping the load and support with the other 2 managers, and so they can have a little time. And the 286, to answer your question, has been spread about not only for this piece, but also the associated pieces with the SHMU, which means we have to look at certain things within the greater zoning bylaw, the OCP, as well as subdivision and servicing bylaw, because there's some impacts on
So we're basically paying consultants with it? Is that what we're doing?
we are hiring consultants for a lot of that work.
Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
thanks.
Okay.
Thanks very much, Councillor Hillian. And I think we've had a good discussion, so I'm not sure, Councillor Paul.
Yeah, I'll move the first, second, and third reading of zoning amendment bylaw number 3140, 2024, small scale multi-unit housing.
I'm just confirming, because in here it has it as 1, 2, and then 3. So
Oh,
can we do all
yeah.
3 at once? Just want to make sure procedurally we get it.
Yes, yeah, we can just do first and second if we're unsure. Yeah. Okay,
We can do all
all
3.
right.
You're good.
In that case, I'm gonna stick with the first, second, and third.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Councillor Frisch.
Oh,
All right. Any further questions or comments? Seeing none, again, thanks staff for the monumental amount of work you've done, and then again tweaking this after the fact. It's much appreciated. All those in favor? And that motion passes. We'll get into council reports. Councillor Cole-Hamilton, Councillor Frisch, Councillor Hillian, Councillor Jolicoeur, Councillor McCullum, Councillor Morin. And I'm just going to mention a couple things. One, the Spirit Walk, again, huge thanks to Indigenous Women's Sharing Society, the Métis Society of the Comox Valley for putting that on. It was an amazing day. Kudos to staff, Pulse on the Plaza, which had its last date on September 27th for this year. And last week we had the all elected officials forum on climate change, and the mayor of Merritt, thanks to the regional district for putting that on. But I think it really brought some reality and hopefully some thought on preparedness, which I think came up in our conversation today. With that, we are adjourned.